Welcome. Night has fallen, the world has turned silent, and the fog is slowly drifting toward the shore. Tonight on NightSleepWhisper, we are embarking on a very long journey together. For 50 chapters, we will lose ourselves among the dusty shelves of Blackwood, inside dark lighthouses, and between the lines of ancient diaries. The Blackwood legacy is waiting to be discovered. Now, find your most comfortable position, dim the lights just a little more, and let these whispers carry you into the cool ocean breeze. If you're ready, our story begins. Mark parked his old blue car in front of the house. He turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment. He looked through the window. The house was small and made of dark wood. It sat on a hill very close to the sea. The sky was grey, and a thick white fog covered the water. Mark sighed, but he was happy. He was a writer, and he needed a quiet place to work on his new book. The city was too loud and too busy. Here, there were no people and no distractions. He opened the car door and stepped out. The air was cold and smelled like salt. He walked to the back of the car and opened the trunk. He had 3 large suitcases full of clothes and many heavy boxes full of books. He carried the first box to the front door. The grass in the garden was long and green. It was clear that nobody lived here for a long time. Mark took a large metal key from his pocket. He put it into the lock and turned it. The door opened slowly. Inside, the house was dark and very dusty. There was a small living room with an old sofa and a wooden table. To the left, there was a tiny kitchen with a white fridge. "It is perfect," Mark said to himself. His voice sounded loud in the empty house. He spent the next 2 hours moving his things from the car to the living room. He worked hard, and his arms felt tired. After the last box was inside, he went to the window. The fog was thicker now. He could not see the ocean anymore. He could only hear the water. The waves hit the rocks below the hill again and again. It was a rhythmic and peaceful sound. Mark decided to explore the rest of the house. He walked down a narrow hallway. There was a bathroom and 1 bedroom. The bedroom had a large bed and a window that looked out at the lighthouse in the distance. The lighthouse was not working, but it looked beautiful in the mist. Then, Mark saw a small door at the end of the hallway. It was different from the other doors. It was made of very heavy, dark wood and had a large iron bolt. He tried to pull the bolt, but it did not move. It was stuck. "I will fix that tomorrow," Mark thought. He went back to the kitchen and made a cup of hot tea. He sat at the wooden table and looked at his empty notebook. He felt excited. This house was old and had a lot of character. He was sure he could write a great story here. However, he also felt a little bit strange. The house was very quiet, but it did not feel empty. It felt like the walls were watching him. Mark shook his head and drank his tea. He was just tired from the long drive. Mark woke up early the next morning. The sun was behind the grey clouds, and the house was very cold. He put on a warm sweater and made some coffee. He looked at the small door at the end of the hallway again. He tried to move the iron bolt, but it was still stuck. He decided to leave it for now. He had a lot of work to do. After breakfast, Mark looked for a place to put his empty boxes. He found a small door behind the kitchen. It was painted white and had a simple metal handle. He opened it and saw a set of wooden stairs. They went down into the dark. Mark found a flashlight in his travel bag. He turned it on and walked down the stairs slowly. Each step he took made a loud noise on the old wood. The air in the basement was very damp. It smelled like old earth and wet stone. Mark moved his light around the room. The basement was large. He saw some old wooden chairs and a broken table covered in dust. In the corner, there were many spider webs. It was clear that nobody came down here for a very long time. Then, he saw something unusual. At the far end of the basement, There was another door. This door was not like the white door upstairs. It was made of very heavy, dark wood. It looked very old and very strong. Mark walked toward it, his boots making a soft sound on the dirt floor. He held his flashlight close to the wood to see better. He looked for a handle, but there was no handle. He looked for a keyhole, but there was no keyhole. The door was just a solid piece of dark wood set into the stone wall. Mark pushed the door with his hand. It did not move. He pushed it harder with his shoulder. It felt as solid as the stone wall itself. "This is very strange," Mark whispered. He looked at the edges of the door. He could not see any hinges. It looked like the door was part of the wall, but he could see a very small gap between the wood and the stones. He was sure it was a door. He wondered why someone would build a door with no way to open it. What were they trying to keep inside? Or what were they trying to keep out? Mark felt a cold shiver on his back. The basement was very quiet, but he felt uncomfortable. He felt like someone was watching him from the shadows. He turned his flashlight around quickly, but the room was empty. Only his own shadow moved on the stone walls. He decided to go back upstairs to the light. He closed the kitchen door and locked it. He sat at his table with his notebook, but he did not write any words. He only thought about the heavy, dark door in the basement. By the afternoon, Mark felt very hungry. He looked at his watch. It was 2 o'clock. He decided to walk to the town to find some food. He also wanted to talk to people. The house was too quiet, and the locked door in the basement was stuck in his mind. He needed a break. The walk to the town was short. The road followed the edge of the cliff. Below, the sea was dark and the waves were tall. The fog was still there, like a thin grey blanket over the water. The air was cold on his face. Soon, he saw the small buildings of the town. The town was called Blackwood Bay. It was a very small place with one main street. There were a few shops, a small post office, and a harbour with 3 or 4 fishing boats. Mark saw a small sign that said, "The Harbour Cafe." He opened the door and went inside. The air was warm and smelled like fresh bread and roasted coffee. There were only a few people inside. An old man sat in the corner reading a book. A woman with long dark hair stood behind a wooden counter. She was about 40 years old and wore a clean white apron. "Hello," the woman said. She had a kind smile. "You must be the writer. My name is Elena. I own this cafe. I know everyone in this town, but I do not know you." "Hello, Elena. I am Mark," he replied. He felt better in the warm room. "I moved into the old house on the cliff yesterday. I am here to write a book." Elena's smile disappeared instantly. Her face became very pale. She was holding a silver spoon, and it fell from her hand. She did not pick it up. She just stared at Mark. "The old house?" she asked. Her voice was very low and shaky. "You mean the house near the lighthouse? The one that was empty for 20 years? "Yes, that is the one," Mark said. He was surprised by her reaction. "Is there a problem?" "The house is a bit dusty, but I like it." Elena looked toward the door and then back at Mark. She looked very nervous. She leaned over the counter and spoke in a whisper. "People in Blackwood Bay do not go to that house, Mark. It is a lonely place. It has a very sad history. You should be careful." "What happened there?" Mark asked. He felt a small chill in his heart. Elena did not answer his question. She began to clean the counter with a cloth. She moved her hands very fast. "What can I get for you to eat?" she asked. She did not look at his eyes again. Mark bought a sandwich and a cup of black coffee. He sat at a small table by the window. He watched Elena. She was talking to the old man in the corner now. They both looked at Mark and then looked away quickly. Mark realized that the house was not the only mystery. The whole town was full of secrets. Mark walked back to his house as the sun began to set. The sky changed from grey to a deep, dark blue. The fog was now very thick and cold. He could not see the lighthouse anymore. He could only see the small yellow light from his own porch. When he entered the house, he locked the front door and pushed the heavy bolt. He felt a little safer inside, but he could not forget Elena's face. She was truly afraid. He decided to try and work. He sat at the wooden table in the kitchen with a glass of water and his notebook. He wrote a few sentences about the sea and the wind, but his mind was not on the story. He kept thinking about the heavy door in the basement and the empty rooms around him. The house felt very large and very cold. He turned on the small heater, but the air stayed chilly. At 11 o'clock, Mark felt very tired. He went to the bedroom and lay down on the bed. He did not turn off the lamp on the side table. He liked the light. Outside, the wind moved the branches of the trees against the walls of the house. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Suddenly, Mark opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. He was very still. He listened carefully. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then, he heard it. On the floor above his head, there was a heavy sound. It was the sound of a foot hitting the wooden floorboards. Then there was another sound, and another. Someone was walking very slowly across the upper floor. Mark felt his heart beat very fast. He sat up in bed and held the blanket tightly. "Is someone there?" he asked. His voice was small and it trembled. There was no answer. The walking stopped for a few seconds. Then, the footsteps started again. They moved from one side of the room to the other. The old wood made a long, sharp sound under the weight of the person. Mark knew there was an attic above the bedroom, but he did not see a way to get there. He thought the house only had one floor and a basement. He stood up and took his flashlight. He walked into the hallway. The footsteps followed him. When he stopped, the sounds above him stopped too. When he walked toward the kitchen, the footsteps moved toward the kitchen. It was as if the person above was watching him through the ceiling. Mark went to the small door at the end of the hallway. He looked up at the ceiling above the door. The sound was very loud here. It was a heavy, rhythmic walking. He put his hand on the heavy iron bolt of the door. He wanted to open it, but he was too afraid. He stood in the dark hallway for a long time, listening to the person walking above him in the empty house. Mark did not sleep for the rest of the night. He sat in the living room with all the lights on. He watched the ceiling and waited for the footsteps to return, but the house remained silent. When the first light of morning entered the windows, Mark felt more courageous. He knew he had to find the way to the upper floor. He began to search the house again. He looked inside every closet and behind every door. Finally, in the back of the small bedroom closet, he found something. High up in the ceiling, there was a square piece of wood with a small metal ring. It was a hatch for the attic. Mark brought a wooden chair from the kitchen. He stood on the chair and pulled the ring. A heavy wooden ladder fell down. The ladder made a sharp noise as it hit the floor. Mark climbed up slowly. The air in the attic was even dustier than the basement. It was also very hot. Small pieces of dust danced in the light from his flashlight. The attic was full of old furniture and cardboard boxes. Mark walked carefully because he did not want the floor to make noise. He thought about the footsteps from the night before. Who was walking here? The room was completely empty of people. He began to open the boxes. Most of them were full of old blankets and broken dishes. But in the corner, under a heavy black coat, he found a box full of papers. He sat on the floor and started to look through them. There were old bills, letters about a garden, and a very old newspaper. The paper was yellow and felt very thin. The date on the front was from 20 years ago. Mark saw a large photograph on the front page. It was a picture of a man with a kind face and expensive clothes. The headline was very large. Local businessman Julian Blackwood still missing. Mark read the article quickly. Julian Blackwood was the man who owned this house. He was very rich and owned many buildings in the town. One night, 20 years ago, he went into his house and never came out. The police searched the house, the cliff, and the sea, but they found nothing. Julian was gone. There was no blood and no sign of a fight. He simply disappeared. Mark looked at the photo of Julian. The man was standing in front of the very same house where Mark was now sitting. In the background of the photo, Mark saw a younger Mr. Henderson and another man he did not recognize. They were all smiling. Mark felt a cold chill. He was living in a house where a man disappeared 20 years ago. And last night, he heard someone walking in this very attic. He looked around the dark corners of the room. Was Julian still here? Or was someone else looking for the same secrets? Mark folded the newspaper and put it in his pocket. He needed to know more about Julian Blackwood. The morning was bright, but the air was still cold. Mark decided to go outside. He felt nervous inside the house after reading the old newspaper. He needed some fresh air and physical work to calm his mind. He looked at the garden in front of the house. It was full of long grass and dead bushes. He wanted to make it look better. Mark found an old shovel in the small shed near the house. He began to dig near a large grey stone. He wanted to clear the space to plant some colorful flowers later. The soil was wet and heavy. He worked for an hour. His hands were dirty, and he was breathing fast. Suddenly, the metal shovel made a sharp sound when it hit something hard in the ground. Mark stopped. He thought it was just another stone. He moved the shovel to the side and hit the object again. This was not a stone. He dropped to his knees and began to move the dirt with his hands. The earth was cold under his fingernails. After a few minutes, he saw a corner of something grey and flat. He dug faster. Soon, he could see the whole object. It was a small metal box, about the size of a book. It was covered in rust and very dirty. Mark pulled the box out of the hole. It was surprisingly heavy. He sat on the grass and wiped the dirt away with his sleeve. The box had a small lock on the front, but the lock was very old. He took a small stone and hit the lock twice. The lock broke and fell into the grass. Mark opened the lid slowly. Inside the box, there was a piece of purple velvet cloth. It was old and a bit damp. He lifted the cloth and found two things. The first was a beautiful silver key. It was long and had many intricate patterns on the handle. It looked very expensive and very important. The second thing was a small piece of wood. Someone had carved a name into the wood with a knife. The name was Julian. Mark stared at the key and the name. Why was this box buried in the garden? Who buried it? He looked back at the hole in the ground. It looked like a small grave for a secret. He felt a sense of fear. Julian Blackwood disappeared 20 years ago, but his name was here, hidden under the earth. He stood up and looked around the garden. He felt like someone was watching him from the trees or from the windows of the house. The town of Blackwood Bay was quiet, but the garden was full of voices from the past. Mark put the silver key and the piece of wood into his pocket. He filled the hole with dirt again. He did not want anyone to know what he found. He walked back to the house, holding the silver key tightly in his hand. Mark sat at the kitchen table. He placed the silver key and the piece of wood in front of him. The sunlight from the window made the silver shine. Now that the dirt was gone, he could see the details. The key was not a normal house key. It was long and thin. The top of the key was shaped like a small bird with its wings open. On the body of the bird, there was a tiny letter J carved into the metal. J for Julian. Mark whispered. He picked up the piece of wood. The name Julian was written in large, messy letters. It looked like someone wrote it in a hurry. The wood was dark and felt soft because it was in the ground for a long time. Mark wondered why someone would bury these things. If the key was important, why not keep it in a pocket or a desk? Burying something usually means you want to hide it forever. Mark thought about the heavy door in the basement. He remembered that it did not have a keyhole. He went to the kitchen drawer and found a small piece of cloth. He cleaned the silver key until it sparkled. Then, he took his flashlight and went back to the basement. He walked down the wooden stairs. The air was still damp and cold. He reached the heavy, dark door at the end of the room. He moved his flashlight slowly over every inch of the wood. He looked at the top, the bottom, and the sides. He was looking for a small hole or a secret opening. There must be a way to use this key, he said to himself. He pushed the key against the wood, hoping a secret door would open. Nothing happened. He searched the stone wall around the door too. He moved some old spider webs, but he only found cold, grey stones. The silver key was beautiful, but it was useless here. Mark felt frustrated. He went back upstairs and stood by the kitchen window. He looked out at the garden. The hole he dug was still visible. Then, he noticed something else. Near the fence of his garden, there was another house. It was a very old house with many trees around it. A man was standing in the garden of that house. It was Mr. Henderson, his neighbor. He was a tall man with white hair and a very straight back. He was holding a pair of garden scissors, but he was not cutting the bushes. He was looking directly at Mark's house. He did not move. He just stood there, watching. Mark felt a wave of cold fear. How long was Mr. Henderson standing there? Did he see Mark digging in the garden? Did he know about the metal box? Mark put the silver key in his pocket and walked away from the window. He realized that in this town, every pair of eyes was a camera, and every neighbor had a memory of Julian Blackwood. Mark decided he could not wait. The way Mr. Henderson watched the house made him feel very nervous. He wanted to know the truth. He put on his jacket and walked out of the back door. The grass was still wet, and the air was misty. He walked slowly toward the wooden fence that separated his garden from Mr. Henderson's property. Mr. Henderson was still there. He was standing near a tall rose bush. He held his garden scissors in one hand. When he saw Mark approaching, he did not move. His face was like a mask of stone. His eyes were small and grey, and they did not look friendly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Henderson," Mark said. He tried to make his voice sound calm and polite. The old man did not speak at first. He looked at Mark's hands, then at his face. "You are the man from the city," Henderson finally said. His voice was deep and very dry. "The writer?" "Yes, that is right," Mark replied. "I am living in the Blackwood house. It is a very interesting place." Henderson narrowed his eyes. "It is a house. Nothing more. You should spend more time writing and less time looking at the neighbors." Mark felt his face get hot. He decided to be direct. "I found an old newspaper in the attic today. It was about Julian Blackwood. It said he disappeared 20 years ago. You were in the photograph with him, Mr. Henderson. You were his friend." The silence that followed was very heavy. A bird flew from a tree, and the sound of its wings was the only noise in the garden. Mr. Henderson's hand tightened around the garden scissors. His face turned a dark red color. "That was a long time ago," Henderson said. His voice was no longer dry. It was angry. Julian is gone. The police looked for him, and they found nothing. It is a closed story. Why are you asking about a dead man? I don't think the story is closed. Mark said bravely. I found something in the garden today. A small box. Henderson stepped closer to the fence. He was very tall, and he looked down at Mark. His anger was like a physical heat. Listen to me, young man. You are a guest in this town. You do not know the people here. You do not know what happened in that house. Some things are buried for a reason. If you continue to dig, you will find only trouble. Was Julian your friend? Mark asked again. Get off my property line. Henderson shouted. He pointed his scissors at Mark. Go back to your house and lock the door. Do not speak to me again. And do not ask questions about Julian. This is your only warning. Henderson turned around and walked quickly toward his large, dark house. He did not look back. Mark stood by the fence for a long time. His heart was racing. He was now certain of one thing. Mr. Henderson was not just a grumpy neighbor. He was a man with a very dangerous secret. Mark ran back to his house and closed the front door quickly. He pushed the heavy bolt into place. He stood in the hallway, breathing fast. Mr. Henderson's words were still in his mind. If you continue to dig, you will find only trouble. Mark looked at his hands. They were shaking. He reached into his pocket and felt the silver key. It was cold and smooth. He knew he should stop, but he could not. The mystery of Julian Blackwood was everywhere. It was in the air, in the fog, and in the old wood of the house. Mark went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water to calm himself. Then, he took his flashlight and opened the white door that led to the basement. He walked down the wooden stairs slowly. The basement smelled like old stone and wet earth. He walked past the dusty chairs and the broken table. He reached the heavy, dark door at the end of the room. This time, he was more careful. He did not just push the door. He put his flashlight very close to the stone wall next to the wood. He moved the light inch by inch. Suddenly, he saw something. Near the right side of the door, one of the stones was slightly different. It was smaller than the others, and it was not as dusty. Mark touched the stone with his fingers. It felt loose. He pulled it carefully. The stone came out of the wall, and a small, dark hole appeared behind it. It was a keyhole, hidden away for 20 years. Mark's heart was pounding in his chest. He took the silver key from his pocket. He looked at the small bird on the handle and the letter J. He put the key into the hole. It fit perfectly. He did not have to force it. Mark took a deep breath and turned the key slowly to the right. A heavy, grinding noise of metal moving against metal filled the basement. It was a deep, low sound that Mark could feel in his feet. The heavy wooden door moved back a few inches. Mark put his shoulder against the wood and pushed with all his strength. The door was very heavy, but it opened slowly. A cold wind came from the darkness behind the door. It smelled like old paper and dried flowers. Mark held his flashlight tightly and stepped through the doorway. He was no longer in the basement. He was in a small, hidden room. He moved his light around the space. He saw a small bed with a grey blanket, a wooden table, and many books on a shelf. There was even a small lamp on the table. It looked like a secret home. Mark realized that Julian Blackwood did not just disappear from the world. Someone had created a place for him to hide, or perhaps, a place to keep him. Mark stood in the center of the small room. His flashlight was the only source of light. He felt like he was stepping back in time. The room was very small, and the ceiling was low. The walls were made of cold stone, but someone had tried to make it look like a home. There was a small rug on the floor, though it was now grey with dust. He moved his light to the wooden table. On it sat a ceramic cup and a small plate. They were empty, but they were clean. Next to the plate was a fountain pen and a bottle of black ink. The ink was dry and hard now. Mark touched the table. The wood was smooth. This was not a prison. It was a sanctuary. Or perhaps, it was a hiding place. Did Julian live here? Mark asked himself. He looked at the bookshelf. There were many books about history, art, and the sea. Mark pulled one book from the shelf. It was a book of poems. He opened it carefully. On the first page, there was a message written in beautiful, flowing handwriting. It said, "To Julian, my best friend. May you find peace in the shadows." There was no name at the bottom, only the date from 21 years ago. Mark then turned his light toward the bed. It was a simple iron bed with a thin mattress. A heavy wool blanket was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. It looked like the person who lived here was very organized. Above the bed, there was a small wooden shelf with a single item on it. It was a framed photograph. Mark picked up the photo. It was a picture of two men standing on a boat. One man was Julian Blackwood. He looked younger and very happy. He was laughing at the camera. The other man was also smiling. Mark looked closer at the second man. His face was familiar. It was a younger Mr. Henderson. They were both holding a large fish and looking at the ocean. They looked like brothers. Why did Mr. Henderson act so angry when Mark mentioned Julian? If they were such good friends, why was Julian hiding in a basement? Mark noticed something else under the bed. It was a small, flat wooden box. He pulled it out. It was not locked. He opened the lid and saw a stack of papers and a small, leather-bound book. The leather was brown and very old. It looked like a diary. Mark's heart skipped a beat. This diary could tell him everything. It could explain why Julian disappeared and who helped him hide. Just as Mark was about to open the diary, he heard a sound from upstairs. It was not the wind. It was the sound of the front door opening. Then, he heard a heavy footstep in the kitchen, directly above the basement. Mark quickly turned off his flashlight. He sat in the total darkness of the hidden room, holding his breath. Someone was inside his house. Mark sat in the darkness for what felt like hours. He did not dare to turn on his light. Above him, the footsteps moved from the kitchen to the living room. They were heavy and slow. Mark held the old diary tightly against his chest. He could hear his own breathing, loud and fast. Finally, the footsteps moved toward the front door. He heard the door open and then close. A long silence followed. Mark waited until his legs felt stiff. Only then did he turn on his flashlight. The light hit the leather cover of the diary. It was covered in a thick layer of grey dust. Mark wiped it with his sleeve. The leather was brown and cracked with age. He sat on the small iron bed and opened the book carefully. The paper was thin and yellow. On the first page, the name Julian Blackwood was written in elegant black ink. Mark began to read. The first entries were about Julian's daily life. He wrote about the sea, his garden, and his business. But the tone of the writing changed quickly. By the third page, Julian sounded terrified. "They are coming for me." One entry said, "My partners do not want a partner anymore. They want a victim. The mayor and the others have a plan for the harbor, and I'm the only one saying no. They think money is more important than our history. I cannot stay in the house. I feel eyes on me every time I walk to the cliff." Mark turned the pages, his eyes moving fast. He read about how Julian and Mr. Henderson built the secret room. Henderson was Julian's only friend. He promised to keep Julian safe while the police searched for him. Julian planned to hide until it was safe to leave the country. "I am a prisoner of my own life." Julian wrote in August, "The basement is cold. Henderson brings me bread and soup, but he looks worried. He says the police asking many questions. He says the town is angry. I want to tell the truth, but I am afraid they will kill me before I can speak. The last entry in the diary was the most important. It was dated just 2 days before Julian disappeared forever. I have the evidence. It said, I have the documents that show the mayor's crimes. I put them in the safe. The silver key will open the way. But I cannot stay here. Henderson is no longer enough. I must meet my secret ally. We will meet at the old lighthouse at midnight. If I do not return, may God help this town. Mark closed the diary. The air in the hidden room felt very thin. He knew he had to find that safe. He knew he had to find out who the secret ally was. But most of all, he knew he was in great danger. The person who was upstairs was likely looking for this very book. Mark put the diary into his pocket. He had to leave the house. But he had to be very quiet. The shadow in the fog was no longer a story. It was a reality. Mark stayed in the hidden room for several minutes. He listened to the silence of the house. The person who was upstairs was gone. But Mark did not feel safe. He knew he could not stay in the basement forever. He climbed back through the secret door, locked it with the silver key, and replaced the loose stone. He moved quickly and quietly back to the kitchen. The house was empty. The front door was closed, but the bolt was now open. Mark felt a cold wind coming from the hallway. He realized the person had a key to his house. He was not the only one with access to this place. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 11 o'clock at night. The diary mentioned a meeting at the old lighthouse at midnight. I have to go, Mark whispered. He took his heavy coat and a warm hat. He put the diary and the silver key deep into his pockets. He did not take his car because the engine was too loud. He wanted to move through the fog like a shadow. He stepped out of the back door and into the cold night. The fog was thicker than ever. It was like walking through a cloud of cold milk. Mark could only see a few feet in front of him. He followed the narrow path that led along the top of the cliff. To his right, the ocean was a dark, angry giant. The water hit the rocks with a powerful force. Every few seconds, a spray of cold salt water hit his face. The old lighthouse stood at the very end of the point. It was a tall, white tower, but the paint was falling off in large pieces. The glass at the top was broken, and the light was dead. It looked like a ghost in the mist. Mark walked slowly, his heart beating in his ears. He was afraid of the height and the dark, but he was more afraid of the truth. He reached the base of the lighthouse at 10 minutes before midnight. The large metal door of the lighthouse was open. It moved slowly in the wind, making a long, metallic sound against the stone. Mark did not go inside yet. He hid behind a large rock near the path. He turned off his flashlight and waited. The silence was heavy. Then, he heard a new sound. It was the sound of footsteps on the gravel path. Someone was coming from the direction of the town. Mark held his breath and pressed his body against the cold stone of the rock. He saw a small yellow light moving through the fog. A person was walking toward the lighthouse. The person stopped in front of the open door. They held a lantern high to see the entrance. Mark could not see the person's face because of a large hood, but he could tell they were tall. The person entered the lighthouse and disappeared into the darkness. Mark waited for a moment. Then, he stood up. He had to know who the secret ally was. He moved toward the open door, his hands trembling in his pockets. Mark entered the lighthouse. The air inside was even colder than the air outside. It smelled like wet iron and old salt. The walls were made of thick stone, and the sound of the ocean was now a distant, low hum. He did not turn on his flashlight. He did not want the other person to see him. He waited for his eyes to adjust to the deep shadows. A faint yellow light glowed from above. The person with the lantern was already climbing the stairs. Mark found the beginning of the staircase. It was a spiral of metal steps that went up into the darkness. He put his hand on the cold railing and took his first step. He was very careful. He moved his weight slowly so the metal did not make a loud noise. He climbed higher and higher. His legs began to feel tired, but he did not stop. Every few steps, he paused to listen. He could hear the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the person above him. The yellow light from the lantern danced on the stone walls, creating long, strange shadows that looked like giants. Finally, Mark reached a small wooden platform near the top of the tower. The person was standing there, right in front of a large, broken window. The wind came through the broken glass, making a soft whistling sound. The person had their back to Mark. They were looking out at the dark ocean and the thick fog. They held the lantern steady in one hand. Mark stayed in the shadows of the staircase. He could see the person's heavy black coat and the dark hood. The person was very still. They looked like a statue. Suddenly, the person spoke. Their voice was low and rough, like stones rubbing together. "I know you are here," the person said. Mark felt a wave of cold fear hit his stomach. He did not move. He did not breathe. How did they know? He was so quiet. "You have been following me since the house, Mark." The figure continued. The person did not turn around. They kept looking at the sea. "You are very curious for a writer. But curiosity is a dangerous thing in Blackwood Bay." The person slowly pulled back their hood. Mark leaned forward just a little bit to see better. In the dim light of the lantern, he saw a profile he recognized. It was not Mr. Henderson. It was someone he saw earlier that day. It was the old man from the cafe, the one who was sitting in the corner and talking to Elena. You were at the cafe," Mark said. His voice was just a whisper. The old man finally turned around. His face was full of deep lines, and his eyes were very bright in the lantern light. He did not look angry. He looked sad. "My name is Arthur," the man said. "I was Julian's lawyer, and I am the only person left who knows where he really went." Arthur held the lantern steady, but his hand was shaking. The light moved across the old stone walls of the lighthouse. "Julian was a good man," Arthur said slowly, "but he was not a careful man. He trusted people who only cared about money. I tried to help him, but the mayor and his friends were too powerful." Before Arthur could say more, they heard a noise from the bottom of the lighthouse. It was the sound of a door hitting the stone wall. Both men became very still. Mark looked down the dark spiral staircase. He saw a small light moving upward. "Someone is coming," Mark whispered. He felt a cold knot of fear in his stomach. "Stay behind me," Arthur said. He stood near the edge of the wooden platform. A few moments later, a figure appeared from the shadows of the stairs. It was Elena. She was wearing a thick yellow raincoat, and her hair was wet from the fog. She was breathing fast, and her face was very red. She looked at Arthur, then she looked at Mark. She did not look happy. "I knew I would find you here," Elena said. Her voice was sharp and loud in the small room. She walked toward Mark and grabbed his arm. "Mark, you must listen to me. You are in a lot of danger. You do not understand what you are doing. Arthur was just telling me about Julian," Mark said. He tried to pull his arm away, but Elena held him tightly. "Arthur is an old man with old stories," Elena shouted. She looked at Arthur with anger in her eyes. "You should not have brought him here. Arthur, you know what happens to people who ask too many questions in this town. My father lost everything because of Julian's secrets. I do not want to see more trouble." She turned back to Mark. Her expression changed from anger to worry. "Mark, the people in the town are talking. They saw you digging in the garden. They know you found the hidden room. The mayor and the police officer are not happy. This house is not a safe place for you. You are a writer from the city. Go back to the city. Leave Blackwood Bay tonight." "I can't leave yet," Mark said. "I found Julian's diary. I need to know the truth." Elena's face became very pale. "The diary? You found it?" She shook her head. "Then it is even worse than I thought. If they know you have that book, they will not let you leave the town. Please, Mark, pack your bags and go. Do not go back to the house. Just go to your car and drive." The wind whistled through the broken glass of the lighthouse window. Mark looked at Arthur, then at Elena. He saw the fear in their eyes. He realized that the mystery of the shadow in the fog was much bigger than one missing man. It was a secret that the whole town wanted to keep buried. Mark left the lighthouse quickly. The wind was very strong now, pushing against his back. He did not look back at Arthur or Elena. He ran down the cliff path as fast as he could. The fog was like a thick, wet wall, but he remembered the way. He reached his small house in 10 minutes. His heart was beating very fast, and his breath was short. When he saw the house, he stopped. The small yellow light on the porch was still on, but the front door was not closed. It was open a few inches. A cold feeling went down Mark's back. He was certain he locked the door before he left for the lighthouse. He walked slowly toward the porch. He did not turn on his flashlight. He stayed in the shadows and watched the windows. He did not see any movement inside. He pushed the door open. It moved slowly and quietly. He stepped into the hallway and turned on the main light. Mark gasped. The living room was a disaster. It looked like a storm had passed through the house. His suitcases were open on the floor. His clothes were everywhere. Shirts, socks, and trousers were tossed across the rug. The cushions on the sofa were pulled off and thrown into the corner. Someone had even looked under the small wooden table. Mark walked to the kitchen. It was also messy. All the drawers were pulled out. His silver spoons and forks were scattered on the floor. A glass bowl was broken into many small, sharp pieces near the sink. The intruder was looking for something very specific. They were looking for the silver key or the diary. Mark immediately put his hand on his coat pocket. He felt the hard shape of the diary and the cold metal of the key. He felt a wave of relief. He was lucky. He took the important items with him to the lighthouse. If he had left them in the house, the intruder would have them now. He went to the bedroom to check the rest of his things. His books were pulled from the shelves and lay on the floor like dead birds. The bed was a mess. The pillows were tossed against the wall, and the blankets were on the floor. Mark felt a great sense of anger. This was his home now, but someone had entered it without permission. They wanted to steal his secrets and scare him away. Suddenly, Mark heard a new sound outside. It was not the wind or the sea. It was the low, deep sound of a heavy car engine. The sound was getting louder and closer. The car was coming up the hill toward his house. Mark ran to the window and looked out through a small gap in the curtains. He saw two bright white lights cutting through the thick fog. The car stopped in front of his garden gate. Mark felt trapped. He could not go out the front door, and he could not stay in the living room. He needed a place to hide immediately. He thought about the basement. He thought about the hidden room. It was the only place where he might be safe. He turned off the lights and ran toward the basement door. He heard the sound of a car door closing and heavy boots walking on the gravel. Mark moved as fast as he could in the dark. He ran down the basement stairs. His heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his neck. He reached the heavy door and used the silver key. The metal made a small sound, but the wind outside was louder. He stepped into the hidden room and closed the door behind him. He did not lock it from the inside because he did not want to make more noise. He sat on the small bed and waited in the total darkness. Above him, the heavy boots walked across the kitchen floor. The person was moving fast now. Mark heard the sound of a chair falling over. Then, he heard the basement door open. Mark held his breath. He pressed his back against the cold stone wall. He heard the footsteps on the wooden stairs. Each step was slow and deliberate. The person was now in the basement. Mark saw a thin line of light under the hidden door. The intruder had a powerful flashlight. The light moved back and forth across the basement. Mark stayed perfectly still. He felt like a mouse hiding from a cat. After a long time, the footsteps moved away. He heard the person go back upstairs. A minute later, the car engine started outside. The sound of the car moved away down the hill until the house was quiet again. Mark waited for 10 minutes before he turned on his own small flashlight. He was shaking, but he was safe for now. He needed to distract his mind. He took the leather diary from his pocket. As he opened it, something slipped out from between the pages. It was a small, square piece of paper. It was another photograph. Mark held the photo close to the light. This picture was older and more yellow than the one he saw on the shelf. In this photo, there were 3 men. They were standing in front of the town hall. The sun was shining, and they all wore expensive suits. On the left was Julian Blackwood. He looked young and very proud. In the middle was Mr. Henderson. He was laughing and had his arm around Julian's shoulder. They truly looked like best friends. But it was the third man that surprised Mark. He was a younger man with very short hair and a serious face. He was wearing a police uniform. Mark looked closely at the officer's face. It was the same man he saw at the police station earlier that day. The officer who told him the case was closed was the same man who was friends with Julian and Henderson 20 years ago. They were all together. Mark whispered. The photo showed a different side of the story. These men were not just neighbors. They were a team. But now, Henderson was angry, the officer was lying, and Julian was gone. Mark realized that the photograph was a map of a broken friendship. He put the photo back into the diary. He knew he could not stay in the house any longer. He had to find Arthur again. Arthur was the only one who wasn't in the photograph. Mark waited until the sun started to rise. The light was weak and grey. He came out of the basement and saw the mess in his house again. He felt sad and angry. He took his backpack and put the diary, the photo, and the silver key inside. He also took a small bottle of water and his wallet. He could not stay in a house with a broken lock. He needed to find a safer place to think. He stepped outside. The fog was thinner now, but the air was still cold. He began to walk toward the town center. He needed to buy some food, but more importantly, he needed to find Arthur's office. He walked along the main road. To his left, the tall trees stood like silent giants. To his right, the cliff dropped down to the sea. The sound of the waves was constant and loud. After 10 minutes of walking, Mark heard a noise behind him. It was the low hum of a car engine. He did not turn around immediately. He kept walking at a steady pace. But the car did not pass him. It moved very slowly, matching his speed exactly. Mark's heart began to beat faster. He looked over his shoulder. It was a large black car with dark windows. He could not see the driver because the glass was too dark. The car was only a few meters behind him. It looked like a shark following a small fish in the water. Mark walked faster. The car moved faster. Mark slowed down. The car slowed down. Why are they doing this? Mark thought. They want me to be afraid. He was right. The black car was a warning. It was a message from the people who owned the town. They wanted him to know that they were watching his every move. He felt very small and very alone on the long, empty road. There were no other people and no other cars in sight. The world felt like it only consisted of him and the black car. Mark decided to try something. He suddenly turned into a narrow path that led through the trees. The black car stopped at the edge of the road. It did not follow him into the trees because the path was too small for a vehicle. Mark ran through the woods. The branches hit his coat, and the ground was slippery with wet leaves. He didn't stop until he reached the other side of the small forest. He came out of the woods near the grocery store. It was a small building with a red sign. He saw a few people standing outside talking. He felt a little safer near other people. But then, he saw the road again. The black car was already there. It was parked across the street from the store. The engine was off, but the dark windows were pointed directly at him. Mark entered the store. His hands were cold, and he was sweating. He did not want to buy food anymore. He wanted to find a way to escape the eyes of the town. He looked at the back door of the store. He had to move fast before the driver of the black car decided to step out. Mark moved quickly to the back of the grocery store. He saw a small door that led to an alley full of empty boxes. He stepped out and closed the door quietly. He did not go back to the main road. Instead, he walked through the narrow alleys behind the shops. He stayed close to the stone walls. He felt like a spy in a movie. After 20 minutes, he reached the back of his own garden. He climbed over the wooden fence and ran into his house. The house was still silent. Mark went straight to the basement. He did not turn on the lights upstairs. He only used his flashlight in the basement. He felt safer under the ground. He went back into the hidden room where he found the diary. He sat on the small bed and looked at the floor. He wondered if there was more to this house than just one hidden room. He remembered the map of the tunnels from his imagination, but he needed to find a real one. He began to move the rug on the floor. Under the rug, the floor was made of heavy wooden boards. He tapped on the wood with his flashlight. Most of the boards made a solid, dull sound. But near the corner of the room, the sound changed. It sounded empty. Mark used his pocket knife to lift the edge of a board. It was not nailed down. He pulled the board up, and then another one. Beneath the floor, there was a dark hole. He moved his flashlight over the opening. He saw a set of very old stone steps leading down even further into the earth. Another level. Mark whispered. He climbed down the steps. The air here was very different. It was not just damp. It was salty. He could hear a low, constant noise. It was the sound of the ocean, but it sounded like it was right next to him. He reached the bottom of the steps and found himself in a long, narrow tunnel. The walls were made of rough stone and were wet with water. The tunnel was long and dark. Mark walked slowly, holding his flashlight in front of him. The floor was sandy. He saw small pieces of dried seaweed on the ground. This tunnel connected the house directly to the sea. He realized that this was how Julian could leave the house without anyone seeing him on the road. It was a perfect escape route. He walked for a long time. The tunnel turned left and then right. Finally, he saw a faint blue light at the end. He walked toward it and found a small opening in the cliffside. He was standing in a small cave just above the beach. The fog was still thick over the water, but he could see the white foam of the waves hitting the rocks. Mark realized that the people in the black car could watch the front door, but they could never see him here. This was his secret way out. He felt a small spark of hope. He was not trapped anymore. He had a way to move around the town in secret. But then, he looked down at the sand near his feet. Something was shining in the dark. Mark knelt down on the sandy floor of the cave. The light from his flashlight was bright against the dark, wet ground. He reached out his hand and picked up the object that was shining. It was small and felt very heavy for its size. He wiped the wet sand away with his thumb. Under the dirt, the object was bright, yellow gold. It was a ring. It was a man's ring, thick and solid. Mark held it up to the light. The gold was very pure and did not have any rust. On the top of the ring, there was a flat, square surface. Carved deeply into the gold was the letter J. It was the exact same style of letter he saw on the silver key and in the old diary. Julian's ring, Mark whispered. His voice was lost in the sound of the ocean. Mark felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the wind. A man like Julian Blackwood, a wealthy and successful businessman, would not simply drop an expensive gold ring in a dark cave. This ring was a part of him. If the ring was here, in the sand, it meant something bad happened in this very spot. Perhaps there was a fight, or perhaps Julian was running so fast that it fell from his finger. Mark looked around the cave more carefully. The walls were wet, and small plants grew in the cracks of the stone. He moved his flashlight over the ground, looking for anything else, a button, a coin, or another clue. But there was only sand, seaweed, and the cold water of the sea. The tide was coming in now. The waves were getting closer to the entrance of the cave. The sound of the water hitting the rocks outside was getting louder and more powerful. He put the gold ring into his pocket. It sat next to the silver key and the diary. He felt like he was carrying the weight of a dead man's life. He realized that this tunnel was not just an escape route. It was a path that led to the truth, and the truth was becoming very dark. He turned away from the blue light of the cave entrance and began the long walk back through the tunnel. The air felt heavy. He thought about the people in the town. He thought about Elena and her warning. He thought about Mr. Henderson and his anger. Did they know about this tunnel? Did they know that Julian's ring was lying here in the dark for 20 years? When he reached the stone steps, he climbed them slowly. He felt tired, but his mind was working fast. He reached the hidden room and put the wooden floorboards back into place. He covered them with the grey rug. He stood in the center of the room and looked at the small bed. Mark knew one thing for certain now. Julian Blackwood did not just leave Blackwood Bay to start a new life. He was a man who loved his home, his garden, and his beautiful things. He would never leave his ring behind. Mark was no longer just a writer looking for a story. He was a witness to a crime that the fog tried to hide. Mark sat on the edge of the small iron bed in the hidden room. The gold ring felt heavy in his palm. He turned it over and over. The light of his flashlight made the letter J glow. This ring was not just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of a very wealthy man's life. Mark opened the leather diary again. He wanted to find more information about Julian's business and his final days. He turned the yellow pages until he found a section about the town's harbor project. Julian was a very successful man. He owned many of the buildings in Blackwood Bay. He had a lot of money in the local bank. But as Mark read more, he discovered something shocking. "The mayor wants my land," Julian wrote. "He wants to build a new harbor for big ships. But I said no. This town is old and beautiful. I do not want it to change. Because of this, the mayor and his partners are angry. They are trying to take my money. They are trying to take my life." Mark read the next entry. It was written on the very last day. "I have taken all my money out of the bank. I do not trust the bank anymore. The manager is a friend of the mayor. I have hidden the gold and the cash in a safe place. Only I know where it is. I will go to the meeting tonight. If everything is okay, I will take the money and leave for the city tomorrow." Mark leaned back against the cold stone wall. He thought about the police report he had read in the old newspaper. The police said Julian Blackwood was a thief. They told the town that Julian took all the money from his business and ran away to a different country. They said he was a bad man who left his friends and his responsibilities behind. The whole town hated him because they thought he stole their future. But the diary told a different story. Julian did not run away with the money. He hid it to keep it safe from greedy people who wanted to steal it from him. And because he disappeared that night, the money was never found. For 20 years, the people of Blackwood Bay believed a lie. Mark looked around the small room. Was the money hidden here? He looked at the floor and the walls again. He did not see a safe. He realized that the safe place was probably not this room. Julian was too smart for that. This room was just for sleeping and hiding. Now Mark understood the truth about the missing man. Julian was not a thief. He was a victim of a big plan. He was a man who tried to protect his town and his fortune. And the people who were following Mark in the black car were not looking for a writer. They were looking for the location of Julian's hidden wealth. Mark was now holding the silver key, the gold ring, and the diary. He was the only person who could find the truth and perhaps the treasure. He felt a heavy weight of responsibility. He knew he could not hide in the basement forever. He had to go to the police station in the morning. He had to find out if there was anyone left in this town who was honest. Mark left his house early the next morning. The sun was pale and weak behind the heavy clouds. He walked down the long hill toward the town center. He did not see the black car on the road today, but he did not feel safe. He felt that many eyes were watching him from the dark trees and the silent windows of the houses. He held the straps of his backpack very tightly. Inside the bag, he carried the diary, the silver key, and the gold ring. He knew these items were dangerous, but they were also his only protection. He arrived at the police station at 9 o'clock. It was a small, square building made of grey bricks. It stood near the town hall and looked very old. The windows were small and dirty. Mark took a deep breath and opened the heavy glass door. Inside, the air was warm and smelled like old paper and cold coffee. The room was very quiet. The only sound was a large clock on the wall. It moved slowly, second by second. Mark looked at the walls. There were posters of missing people and old maps of the coast. Everything in the room felt stuck in the past. A man sat behind a high wooden desk at the far end of the room. He wore a dark blue uniform. He was writing in a large book with a black pen. Mark recognized him immediately. He was the man from the old photograph, the young officer who was friends with Julian and Mr. Henderson 20 years ago. Now, he was much older. His hair was grey, and his face was hard and full of deep lines. "Can I help you?" the officer asked. He did not look up from his book. His voice was cold and very dry. "My name is Mark. I am the writer living in the Blackwood house," Mark said. He tried to keep his voice steady, but his hands were cold. The officer stopped writing. He looked up slowly. His eyes were like two pieces of ice. They were sharp and unfriendly. "I know who you are," the officer said. "I am Officer Reed. Why are you here, Mr. Writer?" "I want to talk about Julian Blackwood," Mark said. He leaned against the wooden desk. "I found some things in the house. I found a diary. It says Julian did not run away. It says he was in danger from people in this town." Officer Reed did not move. He did not look surprised or worried. He leaned forward until his face was close to Mark's. "Listen to me, Mark. That is an old story. Julian Blackwood was a thief. He took money from the good people of Blackwood Bay and he ran away. We looked for him for a long time. The case is closed. It has been closed for 20 years. But the diary says he hidden the money to keep it safe from the mayor." Mark said. "I do not care what a dusty old book says," Reed interrupted. His voice was now a low growl. He stood up. He was a very tall man, and he looked very strong in his uniform. "You are a stranger here. You do not understand our history. Sometimes, people find things they should not find. It is better for everyone if you just go home and write your stories. Leave the past in the ground where it belongs. Mark felt a wave of fear hit his stomach. He looked at Officer Reed's eyes and realized the truth. The police were not going to help him. The law in this town was part of the secret. I see, Mark said quietly. He turned around and walked toward the door. Mark, the officer called out. Mark stopped but did not turn back. The roads are very dangerous in the fog. Be careful when you walk. Accidents happen very easily in Blackwood Bay. Mark walked out into the cold air. His heart was racing. He was completely alone. He had the evidence, but he had no one to give it to. He needed a new plan, and he needed it fast. Mark walked away from the police station. His legs felt heavy and tired. He looked at the street, but it was empty. The fog was like a thick grey wall. He thought about Officer Reed's face. The officer was not a friend. He was part of the problem. Mark realized he could not trust the law in this town. He was completely on his own. He walked up the long hill toward his house. The wind was getting stronger now. It made a low, crying sound in the tall trees. Mark kept his head down and walked fast. Every time a leaf moved, he jumped. He felt like 100 eyes were watching him from the shadows. When he finally reached his garden gate, he stopped. He looked at the front of the house and felt a sharp pain of fear in his chest. Something was very wrong. He walked closer to the porch. He saw something shiny on the wooden floorboards. It was glass. Hundreds of small, sharp pieces of glass were scattered everywhere. He looked up at the large window of the living room. There was a big, dark hole in the middle of the glass. The window was broken. Mark stood very still. His heart was beating fast. Someone was here while he was at the police station. This was not a secret search like before. This was an attack. He did not want to go inside, but he had no other choice. He had to get his things. He opened the front door slowly and stepped into the hallway. The house was very cold. The wind was blowing through the broken window. The curtains were moving back and forth like grey ghosts. Mark walked into the living room. He looked at the floor in the center of the room. There, lying on his rug, was a large, heavy stone. It was a grey rock from the beach. Mark looked at the rock for a long time. He did not move. He felt very small and very vulnerable. The person who threw this rock was strong and angry. They wanted him to know that he was not safe even inside his own home. He looked around the room. He checked the kitchen and the bedroom. The house was empty, but the silence felt heavy and dangerous. He went to the shed and found some old wooden boards and a hammer. He worked quickly to cover the hole in the window. He hit the nails into the wood. He did not like the noise, but he needed to close the house. He felt like he was building a wall against the world. When he finished, the living room was dark and gloomy. He sat on the sofa and looked at the rock again. He picked it up. It was cold and dirty. As he turned the rock over in his hands, he noticed something. There was a piece of white paper tied to the stone with a thin red string. His hands began to shake as he reached for the paper. Mark's fingers were cold and stiff as he pulled at the red string. The string was tied tightly around the heavy stone. He used his pocket knife to cut the cord. The piece of paper was small, white, and clean. It looked very ordinary, but Mark was afraid to open it. He took a deep breath and unfolded the paper. The message was written in large, black capital letters. The handwriting was thick and angry. It said, "Stop looking or you will be next." Mark felt a wave of terror wash over him. He dropped the note onto the rug. The paper landed next to the heavy rock. He looked at the wooden boards he had just nailed over the broken window. They were meant to keep the wind out, but they could not keep out the fear. He realized that his movements were being watched very closely. Every step he took toward the truth brought him closer to a very real danger. "I am not safe," he whispered. He thought about the next part of the note. Who was the first person? He thought about Julian Blackwood. Julian had disappeared 20 years ago. If Julian was the first, then Mark was in the same position now. The people who wanted Julian gone were still in this town. They were older now, but they were still powerful and they were still dangerous. Mark stood up and walked to the kitchen. He needed to think. He looked at his backpack on the table. Inside were the only things that could explain the mystery: the diary, the silver key, and the gold ring. He realized he could not keep these things in his bag anymore. If someone attacked him, they would take the bag first. He needed a better hiding place. He looked at the floor of the kitchen. It was made of old stone tiles. He looked at the walls. Finally, he looked at the old white fridge. He moved the fridge a few inches. Behind it, there was a small hole in the wall for a water pipe. The hole was larger than the pipe. Mark took the diary, the ring, and the key. He wrapped them in a plastic bag to keep them dry. He pushed the bag deep into the hole in the wall and moved the fridge back into its place. He felt a little bit better, but his heart was still racing. He looked at the clock. It was late afternoon. He could not stay in this dark, boarded-up house all night. He needed more information. The police were not going to help him, and Arthur was too far away at the lighthouse. Mark remembered the town library. It was a small building near the harbor. Maybe there were old records there, maps of the town, or old news stories that were not in the newspaper he found. He needed to find a clue that the mayor and Officer Reed could not hide. He took his coat and walked toward the door. He was terrified, but he was also angry. They could break his window, but they could not stop him from finding the truth. Mark walked down the hill toward the town center. The wind was still cold, but the rain had stopped. He found the library near the old harbor. It was a very small building made of red bricks with large, arched windows. Above the door, a stone sign said, "Blackwood Bay Public Library." Mark felt a little nervous as he entered. He did not want anyone to see him looking for secrets. Inside, the library was very quiet and warm. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with wooden shelves. Thousands of books stood in long rows. There was a faint smell of old paper and wood polish. An elderly woman with white hair sat at a small desk near the entrance. She was reading a book and did not look up when Mark walked in. "Hello," Mark said softly. "I am looking for the history section. I want to read about the old families of this town." The woman looked over her glasses. Her eyes were kind. "The local archives are in the back room, young man. We have many records there. Just be careful with the pages. They are very old." Mark thanked her and walked to the back of the building. He found a small room with a heavy oak table and a few green lamps. On the shelves, there were large, leather books and boxes of old letters. Mark began to search for the name. Blackwood. He found a very thick book titled, "The History of the Lighthouse Families." He sat at the table and opened the book. The pages were yellow and very thin. He found a chapter about the Blackwood family. He learned that Julian's grandfather was the person who built the lighthouse 100 years ago. The family was very important to the town. They were the protectors of the coast. As he read, Mark found something very interesting. The book mentioned that the Blackwood house and the lighthouse were connected by private paths. It said these paths were built so the family could reach the lighthouse quickly during big storms. The tunnels. Mark thought. They were not just for hiding. They were part of the town's history. Then, he saw a list of the people who worked at the lighthouse over the years. He looked at the names carefully. He saw the name Henderson, Many times. For 3 generations. The Henderson family were the helpers of the Blackwoods. They worked together to keep the ships safe. But then, Mark saw a different name. In the year Julian disappeared, a new man was mentioned as a special assistant for the harbor project. The name was Mayor Benjamin Thorne. Next to his name, there was a small note written in pencil. Agreement for the new harbor. Mark realized that the fight between Julian and the mayor was not just about money. It was about the lighthouse and the land around it. The mayor wanted to destroy the old history to build something new and expensive. Mark felt a cold shiver. He was sitting in the very place where all the records were kept. But the people outside were trying to erase the truth. He took a small notebook from his pocket and wrote down the names and the dates. He had to find out what happened to that agreement. Mark looked at the thick history book on the table. It was a very old book with a dark brown leather cover. He felt the weight of the book in his hands. It was unusually heavy for its size. He turned the book over and looked at the back cover. The leather was thick, but there was a small, hard bump under the surface. He ran his fingers along the edge of the cover. He felt a small opening in the leather. Someone had cut the inside of the cover very carefully with a knife. Mark used his fingernail to pull at the edge. The leather moved back, and a small metal object fell out onto the table. It was a key, but it was not like the first silver key. This key was very small and made of a dark, dull metal. It did not have a bird or a letter on it. It was a simple key, like the one a person might use for a small jewelry box or a private drawer. A second key. Mark whispered. He remembered the diary of Julian Blackwood. In the last entry, Julian mentioned a safe and a secret agreement. Mark wondered if this small key was for that safe. But where was the safe? He looked at the history book again. On the page where he found the key, there was a small drawing of the town's lighthouse. Next to the drawing, there was a number written in red ink. 1885. Mark wrote the number down in his small notebook. He felt a sudden rush of excitement. He had a new clue. He put the small key into his pocket and closed the history book. He stood up and looked around the room. The elderly librarian was still at her desk, but she was looking at him now. Her expression was not kind anymore. She looked worried and a little bit afraid. "Are you finished with the archives, young man?" she asked. Her voice was thin and shaky. "Yes, thank you," Mark replied. He walked toward the door, trying to look calm. "You should be careful," the woman said as he passed her desk. "The history of this town is like the ocean. Sometimes it is calm, but sometimes it is very deep and dangerous. Some stories are better if they are not finished." Mark did not answer. He stepped out of the library and into the cold evening air. The sun was gone now, and the blue shadows were stretching across the streets. He felt the small key in his pocket. It felt very heavy. He knew he had to go back to the lighthouse, but the path was long and the fog was returning. He also knew a storm was coming. The clouds were very dark, and the air felt heavy with the smell of rain. He walked quickly, avoiding the main street. He did not want to see the black car or Officer Reed again. He had 2 keys now, and he was closer to the truth. But he knew the people who wanted to keep the secret were watching him from the dark corners of the town. The sky finally broke as Mark reached the edge of the cliffs. Huge, heavy drops of rain began to fall, turning the dust on the path into slippery mud. If the shadow in the fog had a favorite weather forecast, this was definitely it. The wind was so strong it felt like an invisible hand trying to push him off the ledge and into the churning Atlantic below. Mark pulled his hood tight. His boots were soaked, and his fingers were numb, but the weight of the 2 keys in his pocket kept him moving. 1 silver, 1 dark, 1 for a door, and 1 for a secret. He reached the lighthouse just as the thunder began to roll, a deep, bone-shaking sound that drowned out the crashing waves. The large metal door was still slightly ajar, just as he had left it. He slipped inside and shoved the door shut, sliding the heavy iron bolt into place. For the first time in hours, he was out of the wind, though the interior of the tower was hardly welcoming. Water leaked from the ceiling, and the air was freezing. He turned on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the spiral staircase. Mark didn't head up this time. Instead, he began to circle the base of the tower. He was looking for the number from the book. 1885. It has to be here. He muttered, his voice echoing off the cold stone. A date, a mark, something. He moved boxes of old rope and rusted lanterns. He cleared away layers of spiderwebs that looked like thick grey curtains. Finally, behind a stack of rotted wooden crates, he found it. Set into the stone wall was a small brass plaque, green with age and salt. It bore the date of the lighthouse's completion, October 1885. Mark knelt in the dirt. He ran his light over the edges of the plaque. At first, it looked like a solid piece of metal bolted to the stone. But when he pushed against the corner, the plaque didn't move, it clicked. He looked closer. In the center of the 8, there was a tiny, circular hole. It was almost invisible to the naked eye, disguised by the texture of the aged brass. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, dull metal key he had found in the library. His heart hammered against his ribs. He inserted the key into the hole. It felt tight, but it turned with a satisfying thunk. Suddenly, a small section of the stone wall behind the plaque shifted. It didn't open like a door. It slid inward, revealing a small, velvet-lined compartment. Inside sat a heavy, wax-sealed envelope and a small leather pouch. Mark reached for the envelope, but as his fingers touched the paper, he heard a sound that made his blood turn to ice. From somewhere high above him, at the top of the spiral stairs, came the sound of slow, rhythmic clapping. Mark froze, his hand still hovering over the velvet-lined compartment. The clapping echoed through the hollow stone tower, a sharp, mocking sound that cut through the roar of the storm outside. He slowly looked up. The beam of his flashlight caught the edge of the metal stairs, but the person above remained in the shadows. Very impressive. Mark. A voice drifted down. It wasn't the gravelly voice of Arthur or the cold growl of Officer Reed. This voice was smooth, educated, and chillingly calm. I must admit, I didn't think a city writer would have the stomach for this kind of detective work. You found in 2 days what we've been looking for 20 years. A figure stepped into the light. It was Mayor Benjamin Thorne. He looked exactly like the man in the library archives, just older, with silver hair and a tailored coat that looked out of place in the dusty lighthouse. He wasn't carrying a weapon. Instead, he held a small, silver lighter, flicking it open and shut. The agreement, Mark said, his voice trembling slightly as he clutched the envelope. Julian didn't run away. You tried to force him to sign over the lighthouse and the cliffs, didn't you? The mayor began to descend the stairs, his leather shoes clicking on the metal. Julian was a sentimental fool. He cared more about tradition and the view than the economic survival of this town. Blackwood Bay was dying. The harbor project would have brought millions. But he held the deeds. He was the anchor dragging us all down to the bottom of the sea. Thorne stopped 10 steps above Mark. The light from Mark's flashlight cast long, monstrous shadows of the mayor against the curved wall. Where is he? Thorne. Mark demanded. What happened that night at the lighthouse? The mayor sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. He was supposed to sign the papers and leave. We had a boat waiting to take him to the city. But Julian, he was stubborn. He realized Arthur had helped him hide the evidence of our creative financing. He tried to run. In the fog, on those wet rocks. Accidents happen. Mark. Just as Officer Reed warned you. Mark felt a surge of adrenaline. He knew the truth now. Julian hadn't been a thief. He had been a man murdered by the greed of his peers. The shadow in the fog wasn't a ghost. It was the collective guilt of a town led by a criminal. "You won't get away with it," Mark said, backing toward the heavy metal door. "I have the diary. I have the ring. And I have this." He held up the wax-sealed envelope. Thorne's eyes narrowed, the calm mask finally slipping. "You have nothing but a death wish. Do you really think you're leaving this tower? Look outside, Mark. The storm is our cover, just as it was 20 years ago." Suddenly, the heavy iron door Mark had bolted began to shake. Someone was on the other side, hitting it with a sledgehammer. The sound was deafening, a rhythmic vibration that moved through the very floor. "Reed is a very patient man," the mayor whispered, "but he doesn't like to be kept waiting." The iron door groaned under the force of the sledgehammer. Each blow sent a shower of rust and dust into the air. Mark looked at the mayor, then at the envelope in his hand. He was trapped between a corrupt politician and a violent policeman. He needed a miracle, or at the very least, a very fast exit. "Give me the envelope, Mark," Mayor Thorne said, stepping down another few stairs. He held out his hand, his voice regaining its smooth, persuasive tone. "You're a writer. You understand how stories work. Sometimes, the hero has to make a compromise to survive the final chapter. Hand it over, and I'll ensure you make it to the town limits safely. Like you did for Julian." Mark spat back. The door finally buckled. A massive crack appeared in the wood, and the iron hinges screamed as they were torn from the stone. Officer Reed's shadow loomed in the doorway, the heavy sledgehammer resting on his shoulder. He stepped into the light, his uniform soaked and his eyes fixed on Mark with a predatory gleam. "He's got the papers, Benjamin," Reed said, his voice a low rumble. Mark backed away, his heels hitting the crates he had moved earlier. He remembered the library archive. The house and the lighthouse were connected by private paths. He looked frantically at the floor around the base of the tower. If there was a tunnel leading to the house, it had to start here. His flashlight swept over the floorboards near the brass plaque. He saw it, a heavy iron ring recessed into a stone slab, partially hidden by the debris of the rotted crates. It was a trapdoor, identical in design to the one in his own basement. The tunnel, Mark realized. "Don't let him get to it," Thorne shouted, his composure finally shattering. Mark didn't wait. He dropped his flashlight, grabbed the iron ring with both hands, and pulled. The stone slab was incredibly heavy, but the adrenaline coursing through his veins gave him a burst of desperate strength. With a loud, grinding noise, the slab lifted. Officer Reed lunged forward, the sledgehammer swinging in a wide, lethal arc. Mark threw himself into the dark opening just as the hammer smashed into the stone where his head had been a second before. He didn't climb down. He fell, sliding down a steep, slick stone chute that smelled of salt and ancient dampness. He landed hard on a sandy floor, the breath knocked out of him. Above, he heard the mayor screaming orders and the heavy thud of Reed's boots hitting the floor near the trapdoor. Mark scrambled to his feet, fumbling in the dark until his hands found the leather pouch and the envelope he had tucked into his jacket. He didn't have his flashlight. It was still spinning on the floor above. But he had his phone. He flicked on the screen. The pale light revealed the narrow stone tunnel stretching out into the gloom. He started to run, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't just running for his life anymore. He was running to make sure Julian's story finally had an ending that the fog couldn't hide. Mark's phone light was a weak, flickering blade against the crushing dark. This section of the tunnel was tighter than the one he had explored earlier. The ceiling dripped with cold, slimy condensation that felt like ghostly fingers brushing his neck. Behind him, a heavy thud echoed through the stone. Reed had landed at the bottom of the chute. Then came the sharp, electronic chirp of a radio crackling. "He's in the lower line. Benjamin, block the basement access." Reed's voice was distorted by the narrow stone walls, but the threat was perfectly clear. They were going to box him in. Mark ran faster, his lungs burning. The tunnel suddenly split into two distinct paths. To the left, the air smelled of heavy salt and wet sand, the way to the sea cave. To the right, the air was stagnant, smelling of dry rot and old wood, the path back to his basement. He paused, remembering the old maps and the private paths mentioned in the library. Mark chose the right path. He needed to get back to the house, retrieve the diary and the ring, and somehow reach his car. He scrambled over loose rocks, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But as he neared the end of the passage, where the stone steps led up to his hidden room, he saw a flicker of light from above. The floorboards groaned. Someone was already in the basement, pacing right above the trapdoor. He was trapped. He retreated silently, his heart hammering against his ribs, and headed back toward the left fork, the sea cave. The sound of the ocean grew from a distant hum to a roaring beast. As he reached the opening, he saw that the tide had come in significantly. The secret way out was now a churning pool of dark, freezing Atlantic water. Mark pulled out the leather pouch he had snatched from the lighthouse compartment. Inside, he didn't just find papers. He found a heavy, old-fashioned brass compass and a small, silver flash drive, a modern addition to a 20-year-old secret Julian had been preparing for a long time. "Nowhere left to run, writer." Reed's voice boomed from the tunnel behind him. The beam of the officer's heavy-duty flashlight cut through the dark, reflecting off the wet cave walls. Mark looked at the crashing waves, then at the evidence. He realized the secret ally Julian mentioned in his diary wasn't just Arthur. There had to be someone else, someone who knew about the modern update to the files. He looked at the brass compass in his hand. The needle wasn't pointing north. It was fixed firmly toward a specific, jagged rock formation out in the bay, known by the locals as the Widow's Peak. With Reed only seconds away, Mark took a deep breath, tucked the waterproof pouch into his inner pocket, and dived into the cold, black water of the rising tide. The water was a shock of liquid ice that stole the breath from Mark's lungs. For a few terrifying seconds, he was tumbled in the dark, the current of the rising tide pulling him toward the jagged teeth of the cliffside. He surfaced, gasping for air, the salt stinging his eyes. Behind him, the mouth of the sea cave was illuminated by Reed's flashlight, a mocking eye in the darkness. He heard a faint shout over the roar of the waves, then the sharp crack of a gunshot. He didn't look back. He kicked with everything he had, his heavy boots dragging him down like anchors. He focused on the dark silhouette of the Widow's Peak, a jagged spire of rock that rose from the bay like a warning finger. In the flashes of lightning, he saw something else, a small, steady green light blinking at the base of the rock. It wasn't the lighthouse. It was a signal. His limbs felt like lead, and his vision began to blur from the cold. Just as his strength began to fail, a dark shape loomed out of the fog. It wasn't a rock. It was the hull of a small, sturdy fishing boat. "Over here. Grab the line." The voice was female, high and sharp against the wind. A thick rope hit the water inches from Mark's face. He lunged for it, his frozen fingers barely able to curl around the hemp. He was pulled toward the boat, and two strong hands grabbed the collar of his jacket, hauling him over the side and onto the deck. Mark lay on the wet wood, shivering violently. Above him stood Elena. She wasn't wearing her yellow raincoat anymore. She was dressed in dark gear, her face set in a look of grim determination. She didn't say a word as she shoved a thick wool blanket over him. She moved back to the helm, and the engine roared to life, a deep, powerful thrum that cut through the sound of the storm. "I told you to leave, Mark," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I told you this town was a graveyard, but you just kept digging." The compass. Mark managed to stammer, his teeth chattering. "It pointed here." Julian knew. "Julian was my uncle," Elena said, turning the boat away from the shore and heading deeper into the fog. "Arthur and I have been waiting for someone to find that flash drive for 20 years. We couldn't do it ourselves. Thorne has watched us every single day since Julian disappeared. He knew we were the only ones who cared enough to keep looking." Mark looked back at the shore. The lights of the lighthouse were fading into the mist, and the dark shape of the black car was parked at the cliff's edge, its headlights cutting uselessly into the Atlantic. For the first time, the shadow in the fog felt like it was finally lifting. "Where are we going?" Mark asked, clutching the waterproof pouch. "To the only person Thorne can't buy," Elena replied, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "The federal authorities in the city. We have the evidence, Mark. Now, we just have to survive the trip." The small fishing boat, named the Silver Tern, cut through the waves with a violent, rhythmic slamming. Elena was a master of the helm, her eyes locked on the radar screen. The green sweep of the dial showed the jagged coastline receding, but it also showed something else, a small, fast-moving blip coming from the harbor. "They're coming," Elena shouted over the wind. "The police boat. It's faster than us, and Reed knows these waters as well as I do." Mark huddled in the corner of the cabin, the wool blanket wrapped tight around his shivering frame. He looked out the salt-streaked window. Through the swirling grey mist, a pair of powerful blue and red lights flickered. The police launch was closing the distance, its bow slicing through the swells like a knife. "Can we outrun them?" Mark asked, clutching the waterproof pouch as if it were his only anchor to the world. "In this weather?" "Maybe," Elena replied, her teeth gritted. "But we don't need to outrun them forever. We just need to reach the shipping lanes. Once we're in international waters or near the Coast Guard patrol, they won't dare fire a shot." Suddenly, a bright spotlight hit the back of the boat, turning the spray into a wall of blinding white light. A voice boomed over a megaphone, distorted by the wind but unmistakable. "Stop your engine, Silver Tern. This is the Blackwood Bay Police. You are obstructing a criminal investigation." "Criminal investigation?" Mark scoffed. "He means a cover-up." Elena didn't slow down. Instead, she steered the boat toward a cluster of dark, foam-covered rocks known as the Devil's Teeth. It was a dangerous move. The narrow channel was filled with unpredictable currents that could rip the bottom out of a hull in seconds. "Hold on to something," she yelled. The boat leaned hard to the left, the engine screaming as Elena pushed the throttle to its limit. Mark watched as the police boat followed, its spotlight dancing wildly across the waves. Then, a loud, metallic scrape echoed through the air. The police boat had hit a submerged rock. It didn't sink, but it slowed down, its engine coughing a cloud of dark smoke. "They are hit," Mark cheered. "Don't celebrate yet," Elena warned. "Reed is like a dog with a bone. He won't stop until he sees us underwater." As they cleared the rocks, the fog began to lift slightly, revealing the vast, dark expanse of the open ocean. In the distance, the lights of a massive cargo ship flickered like a floating city. That was their destination. If they could reach the ship, they could signal for help. Mark looked down at the pouch. He felt the cold shape of Julian's ring through the plastic. He realized that the shadow in the fog wasn't just a mystery he was writing. It was a legacy he was now part of. He was no longer just the observer. He was the one bringing the light. The Silver Tern was pushing its limits. The engine's roar had turned into a desperate, high-pitched whine, and the smell of hot oil filled the small cabin. Behind them, the police boat was a wounded predator. Its blue and red lights were dimmer, and it sat lower in the water. But it was still coming. Reed was determined to bury Julian's secrets in the deep water of the Atlantic. "We're almost there," Elena shouted, pointing toward the massive dark wall of the cargo ship. It loomed over them like a mountain of steel. "Mark, get the emergency flares from the locker under your seat. We need to make sure they see us." Mark scrambled to the floor. He pulled open the locker and found a small orange box. Inside were 3 flare guns and a handful of cartridges. He grabbed one, his hands still shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. He stepped out onto the slick, pitching deck. The wind tried to tear the gun from his hand, and the spray blinded him. He looked back. The police boat was close enough that he could see the silhouette of Officer Reed standing on the bow. Reed wasn't holding a megaphone anymore. He was holding a rifle. "Get down!" Mark screamed as a spark of light flashed from the police boat. The bullet shattered the wooden railing of the Silver Tern just inches from Mark's hip. He didn't wait. He pointed the flare gun toward the black sky and pulled the trigger. A brilliant red light streaked upward, cutting through the fog and the rain. It exploded into a blinding crimson star that illuminated the entire bay. For a second, everything was frozen in red. The white foam of the waves, the rust on the cargo ship's hull, and the desperate face of Officer Reed. The signal. Primary flare. Red. Altitude. 300 meters. Visibility. 5 miles in clear weather. A moment later, a massive horn blast echoed across the water, a deep, booming sound that shook the very air in Mark's lungs. The cargo ship had seen them. High above, powerful floodlights flickered on, sweeping the water. Then, a new sound joined the storm, the heavy rhythmic beating of rotor blades. From the direction of the city, a Coast Guard helicopter appeared, its searchlight piercing the mist like a heavenly spear. The light centered on the Silver Tern, then swung over to the police launch. "Police vessel, this is the Coast Guard." A voice thundered from the sky. "Cease your pursuit and identify yourselves immediately. You are in a commercial shipping lane." The police boat slowed. The blue and red lights flickered once, then went dark. Reed knew the game was over. In the glare of the helicopter's light, Mark saw the police boat turn slowly, heading back toward the shadows of Blackwood Bay. Elena slumped over the helm, a long, shaky breath escaping her lips. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Mark leaned against the cabin wall, the waterproof pouch held tight against his chest. He looked at the ring on his finger. He had put it on without realizing it. It was a perfect fit. The shadow in the fog was finally being chased away by the morning light and the long arm of the law. 6 months later, the sun was shining over Blackwood Bay. The thick, oppressive fog that once defined the town seemed to have retreated, leaving the air crisp and the ocean a brilliant, sparkling blue. Mark sat on the porch of the Blackwood house. The broken window had been replaced with beautiful new glass, and the old garden was no longer a mess of dead weeds. Bright yellow daffodils and blue hydrangeas now lined the path, a gift from Elena. He took a sip of hot coffee and looked at the heavy package on the table. It was the first printed copy of his new book, The Shadow in the Fog, the true story of Julian Blackwood. The trial had been the biggest event in the county's history. The flash drive and the diary provided a paper trail that even Mayor Thorne's expensive lawyers couldn't erase. Thorne and Officer Reed were now serving long sentences for corruption, fraud, and their roles in the disappearance of Julian Blackwood. But the most important discovery wasn't the crimes. It was the truth. Julian's hidden wealth was found exactly where the silver key and the diary indicated, in a secure vault beneath the old lighthouse, dedicated to a trust fund for the town's children and the preservation of the coast. Julian hadn't been a thief. He had been the town's greatest benefactor. The Blackwood legacy. Julian Blackwood, posthumously awarded the town key. The Harbour Project, cancelled in favor of a marine sanctuary. The lighthouse, fully restored and operational. Arthur had retired to a small cottage by the sea, finally at peace. Elena had taken over the management of the harbour. ensuring it remained a place for local fishermen rather than giant corporations. Mark looked down at his hand. He still wore Julian's gold ring on his right hand. He had tried to give it to Elena, but she insisted he keep it. "You're a Blackwood by choice now, Mark," she had said with a rare smile. "And every house needs a keeper of stories." A familiar car pulled up at the gate. It wasn't a black sedan this time. It was Elena's rugged old truck. She hopped out, waving a newspaper. The headline read, "Blackwood Bay named most beautiful coastal town. Ready for the dedication ceremony." She called out. Mark stood up, tucking his pen into his pocket. He looked back at the house that had tried to scare him, then tried to hide him, and finally, had given him the greatest story of his life. He wasn't a city writer anymore. He was just a man who had learned that sometimes, you have to go into the basement to find the light. "Ready," Mark said, stepping off the porch and into the warm afternoon sun. The peace of Blackwood Bay was beautiful, but for a man like Mark, it was also surprisingly heavy. Success had brought him many things: a best-selling book, a repaired house, and the respect of a town that had once viewed him with deep suspicion. But as the autumn leaves began to turn a fiery orange, a new kind of restlessness settled into the marrow of his bones. He spent his afternoons walking the cliffs, watching the fog roll in, no longer a thing of terror, but a familiar shroud. He felt like a guardian of a story that wasn't quite finished. One Tuesday morning, the postman brought a letter that didn't look like the usual fan mail or royalty statements. The envelope was made of thick, creamy vellum, and the return address was a law firm in London. Sterling, Halloway, and Finch. Mark sat at his kitchen table, the very place where he had first decoded Julian's diary, and broke the wax seal. "To the current resident of the Blackwood estate. We represent the interests of a silent partner in the original Blackwood Bay Harbour Syndicate. In light of the recent criminal proceedings involving Mr. Benjamin Thorne, our client has decided to exercise a reversionary clause found in a 1995 contract. You are hereby notified that a representative, Mr. Silas Vane, will be arriving on the 3rd of February to conduct a secondary survey of the property, specifically the subterranean structures." Mark felt a familiar cold spike in his chest. Subterranean structures. He had disclosed the secret room and the tunnels to the authorities, and they had been thoroughly searched. What could possibly be left? He looked at the date on the letter. February 3rd was only 3 days away. He immediately called Elena. Her voice was strained when she answered. "I got one too, Mark. But mine isn't about the house. It's about the lighthouse. This London firm claims that the land under the lighthouse was never part of the Blackwood family's original deed. They're claiming it belongs to a maritime trust established in the 1800s. Silas Vane." Mark said the name aloud, testing the weight of it. "Do you know him?" "Never heard of him," Elena replied. "But Mark, be careful. If Thorne was the snake in the grass, these people sound like the wolves in the woods. They don't want the money, they want the geography." That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He went down to the basement, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He walked to the hidden room, now empty of its secrets. He sat on the stone floor and closed his eyes, trying to listen to the house. For months, it had been silent, but tonight, he heard a faint, rhythmic sound. It wasn't the ocean, and it wasn't the wind. It was a dull, metallic thrumming, coming from somewhere deep beneath the floor of the secret tunnel. He realized then that the shadow in the fog hadn't been a single ghost. It was merely the first layer of a much deeper, much older secret that reached all the way across the Atlantic. Silas Vane arrived exactly at noon on the 3rd of February. Unlike the local villains who preferred the cover of darkness and the intimidation of heavy boots, Vane arrived in a silver luxury SUV that looked like a polished blade against the rugged backdrop of the cliffs. He stepped out of the vehicle wearing a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than Mark's first 3 book advances combined. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like a solution. Mark met him on the porch. He had spent the morning preparing, coffee in hand, trying to channel the same courage he had found in the lighthouse. But Vane didn't start with threats. He started with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Eyes that were a pale, crystalline blue. "Mr. Mark," Vane said, extending a hand encased in a leather glove. "I've read your book. A gripping narrative. A bit sensationalist regarding the legalities, but quite a page-turner. I'm Silas Vane." Mark didn't take the hand. "I've had enough visitors lately. Mr. Vane, if you're here about the reversionary clause, you can speak to my lawyer in the city." Vane didn't seem offended. He lowered his hand and pulled a slim tablet from his coat pocket. "Your lawyer is currently reviewing a 300-page brief regarding the original Maritime Charter of 1842. While he's busy with the paperwork, I have a court-sanctioned right of entry. My interest isn't in your charming living room or your royalties. I'm here for what lies beneath." "The tunnels are empty," Mark said firmly. "The police and the federal agents scoured every inch. There's nothing left but salt and spiders." Vane stepped closer, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "The police were looking for gold and ledgers. Mr. Mark, my clients are looking for the iron chamber. They believe Julian Blackwood wasn't just hiding money. He was hiding a technical legacy. A set of blueprints and a prototype that should never have belonged to a private citizen." Mark felt a flicker of the same curiosity that had driven him into the basement 6 months ago. The iron chamber. There was nothing like that in the diary. Julian was many things, but he wasn't a fool. Vane replied, walking toward the front door as if he already owned the place. He knew that if the mayor or Reed found the chamber, they would sell it to the highest bidder. So, he omitted it from the diary he knew someone might eventually find. But the maritime records in London tell a different story. Vane paused at the threshold, looking back at Mark. "The thrumming you've been hearing. That's not the ocean. It's a pressurized ventilation system that has been running on a geothermal clock for over 80 years. The chamber is waking up, Mark. And if we don't open it correctly, the pressure change will collapse the entire cliffside, including this house and the lighthouse." Mark looked at the polished man and realized the stakes had shifted. This wasn't about local corruption anymore. This was about a secret that was literally built into the foundation of the town. Mark led Silas Vane down into the basement. The air felt colder than usual, as if the house itself were drawing a deep, anxious breath. Vane didn't carry a heavy flashlight like Officer Reed had. Instead, he wore a sleek, high-tech headlamp and carried a briefcase made of reinforced carbon fiber. When they reached the hidden room, Vane didn't even look at the small iron bed or the shelf where the diary had once rested. He walked straight to the back wall, the one that shared its foundation with the very bedrock of the cliff. The police were looking for hollow sounds by tapping with hammers. Vane said, his voice echoing with a touch of professional disdain. "How quaint. They were looking for air. We are looking for density." He opened his briefcase. Inside sat a device that looked like a hybrid between a medical ultrasound and a geological scanner. He called it the Hollowell Sonic Imager. He began to run a small, handheld sensor over the stone blocks. On a small screen, a series of complex wave patterns began to dance. "Tell me about this iron chamber," Mark said, crossing his arms. Julian's diary spoke of his wealth and his desire to protect the town. It never mentioned blueprints or high-tech legacies. Vane didn't look up from the screen. Julian's grandfather wasn't just a lighthouse keeper, Mark. He was an engineer who worked with some of the most brilliant minds of the late 19th century. They were obsessed with the idea of a perfect beacon, a light that didn't rely on oil or electricity, but on the thermal energy of the Earth itself. They called it the geothermal core. Sonic scan parameters. Frequency. 15 to 25 kilohertz. Depth, 10 meters into bedrock. Integrity, 88% solid, structural anomalies detected. Suddenly, the device emitted a sharp, steady beep. The screen changed from blue to a deep, pulsing red. Vane slowed his movements, focusing the sensor on a specific cluster of stones near the floor. "There," Vane whispered. "The police missed it because the door isn't made of wood or stone. It's a localized magnetic seal. The thrumming you heard. That's the induction coil keeping the seal pressurized. If we had tried to blow this open with explosives, the resulting vacuum collapse would have sucked the foundation of this house into the sea." Mark looked at the screen. Beneath the stone, the imager showed a perfectly circular void. It looked like a giant eye buried in the earth, staring back up at them. In the center of the circle was a shape that Mark recognized instantly. The same bird symbol that had been on the silver key. "But I gave the silver key to the federal authorities," Mark said, his heart beginning to race. Vane finally looked up, a cold, thin smile crossing his face. The silver key was for the diary and the lighthouse safe. "Mark, to open the ion chamber, you don't need a key. You need a specific frequency." Vane reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tuning fork made of a strange, dark metal. He struck it against the stone wall. The sound was so high and sharp it made Mark's ears ache. As the vibration traveled through the air, the floor beneath their feet began to tremble. The humming grew louder, a deep resonance that seemed to vibrate not just in the walls, but in Mark's very teeth. Slowly, the heavy stone floorboards didn't just slide, they retracted like the iris of a camera. Beneath the stone lay a perfectly circular hatch made of a dull, non-reflective metal, the ion chamber's true seal. "Remarkable," Vane whispered, his composure finally cracking into genuine awe. "The seal is held by vacuum pressure and magnetic levitation." Julian's grandfather was decades, perhaps centuries, ahead of his time. As the pressure equalized, the hatch sank a few inches and then slid sideways into a hidden recess. Below them lay a vertical shaft, lined with copper piping and brass rungs. Vane didn't wait for an invitation. He hooked his briefcase to his belt and began the descent. Mark followed, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and an insatiable need to see the end of this story. At the bottom, they stepped into a room that looked like a cross between a Victorian laboratory and a modern engine room. The walls were lined with glass-fronted cabinets containing delicate brass instruments, leather-bound ledgers, and strange, glowing vacuum tubes. In the center of the room sat the perfect beacon, a massive, spherical device constructed from layers of quartz and dark iron. The geothermal core. Vane breathed, walking toward it. It taps into the thermal vents deep beneath the cliff. It doesn't just produce light, it produces a self-sustaining energy field. This is what the syndicate wanted. Not the harbor, not the land. They wanted the power source that could render coal and oil obsolete. Mark walked over to a desk covered in blueprints. They weren't just for the engine. They were plans for a network of beacons stretching across the coast. Julian wasn't just protecting a lighthouse. Mark realized. He was protecting the prototype for a new era of energy. He knew if this fell into the hands of men like Thorne, it would be weaponized or hidden away to protect the profits of the old world. And he was right. Vane said, his voice turning cold as he opened his briefcase and pulled out a small, metallic cylinder. "But the old world has very long arms. Mark, my clients aren't here to preserve this. They're here to extract it." Vane began attaching the cylinder to the base of the core. A series of small green lights flickered to life. Mark realized with a jolt of terror that Vane wasn't just a surveyor. He was a retrieval specialist. "Wait," Mark said, stepping forward. "You said the pressure change could collapse the cliff. If you remove that core, what happens to the lighthouse? What happens to the town?" Vane looked at him, his blue eyes as empty as the Atlantic at night. Progress requires sacrifice. Mr. Mark, you should know that. You wrote the book on it. Once the core is detached, the thermal pressure will have nowhere to go. This chamber will become a vent. The house will likely be gone by morning. Mark looked at the gauges lining the wall. They weren't measured in standard units, but in a series of strange, runic scales that Julian's grandfather must have devised. One needle, tipped in bright red, was vibrating violently near the top of its glass housing. The air in the iron chamber was growing thick with the smell of ozone and heated metal. Vane was focused on his extraction cylinder, his fingers moving with surgical precision as he adjusted the magnetic clamps. In 5 minutes, the core will be stabilized within the transport field. Vane said, his voice clipped and devoid of emotion. I suggest you climb that ladder now. Mark. The heat signature is about to spike, and the air will become unbreathable for anyone without a respirator. You don't understand. Mark argued, his eyes darting across the blueprint strewn across the heavy oak desk. This isn't just a battery you can unplug. It's a pressure valve. According to these notes, the core acts as a heat sink. If you take it, the thermal gases from the vent below will expand instantly. It won't just be a vent, Vane. It'll be a geothermal explosion. Vane chuckled. My engineers in London have run 1,000 simulations on this data. The bedrock here is solid granite. There will be some localized seismic activity. Yes, but nothing a well-insured writer can't handle. Now, stand back. You're interfering with a multi-million-pound recovery operation. Mark ignored him. He grabbed a heavy brass lever near the cooling pipes. On the blueprint, it was labeled emergency diverter. He threw his entire weight against it, hoping to vent the excess heat into the sea tunnels before the pressure peaked. Nothing happened. The lever was rusted shut, frozen by 80 years of salt and stillness. Vane looked up, his expression hardening into a glare. Don't be a hero, Mark. You're out of your depth. This is high-level industrial salvage, not a mystery novel. Go upstairs and pack your things. The thrumming suddenly shifted into a high-pitched scream. The quartz sphere in the center of the room began to glow with a fierce, violet light that made the shadows dance like frantic ghosts. Sparks jumped between the iron rings, and the temperature in the chamber rose by 10 degrees in seconds. Mark could feel the sweat beginning to pour down his face, stinging his eyes. The pressure is building too fast. Mark shouted over the rising roar of the machine. Vane frowned, checking his tablet. His calm mask finally slipped, replaced by a look of confusion. That's not right. The induction should be dropping. He tapped the screen frantically. The thermal vent has shifted. There's a tectonic surge coming up from the fault line beneath the bay. The core isn't absorbing it, it's amplifying it. The floor buckled. A deep crack appeared in one of the copper pipes, and a jet of superheated steam hissed into the room. Vane fell back, shielding his face from the scalding mist. The cylinder he had attached to the core began to blink a steady, ominous red, a warning of imminent containment failure. Mark realized that the silent partner in London hadn't accounted for the living earth beneath Blackwood Bay. The town was sitting on a sleeping giant, and Vane had just poked it with a needle. We have to shut it down. Mark yelled. You can't. Vane screamed back, his voice cracking with panic. The sequence is automated once it reaches the 90% threshold. If the core isn't removed now, it will melt through the floor and hit the water table. It'll blow the entire cliff into the stratosphere. Mark looked at the ladder, then at the screaming machine. He couldn't let his home, and the history he had fought so hard to save, be vaporized because of corporate greed. He needed to find the one thing Julian would have left for an emergency: the manual override. The heat was becoming unbearable, a thick, heavy blanket of steam that tasted like copper and ancient sulfur. The violet light from the core pulsed with the rhythm of a dying star. Silas Vane was backed against the wall, his high-tech tablet discarded on the floor, the screen shattered by the rising heat. He was no longer a polished retrieval specialist. He was a man staring at his own grave. Mark scrambled toward the heavy oak desk. He ignored the blueprints and began pulling at the drawers. The first two were empty, but the bottom drawer was locked. He didn't have a key, so he grabbed a heavy brass paperweight, a replica of the Blackwood lighthouse, and smashed the wood. Inside was a small, velvet-lined box. Mark flipped it open. It wasn't a key or a tool. It was a silver whistle and a small, hand-drawn map of the core's internal gears. A whistle! Mark shouted over the roar. "Julian, you've got to be joking." He looked at the map. It showed a series of acoustic sensors buried within the quartz sphere. Julian's grandfather hadn't just used magnetism and heat. He had used harmonic resonance. The entire machine was tuned like a massive musical instrument. The manual override wasn't a lever or a button. It was a sound. Mark looked at the map. It indicated a specific sequence of notes. High, low, high, sustained. He stood up, his legs shaking. The ground beneath him felt like it was made of liquid. He raised the silver whistle to his lips. Vane watched him, his eyes wide with disbelief. A whistle? You're going to stop a geothermal blowout with a whistle? Shut up, Vane! Mark yelled. He blew into the whistle. The first note was a sharp, piercing shriek that seemed to cut through the roar of the steam. The violet light in the core flickered. He blew again, a low, mournful tone. The vibration changed. The high-pitched screaming of the metal pipes dropped an octave. Mark followed the sequence on the map. High. The quartz sphere slowed its rotation. Sustained. He held the final note until his lungs felt like they were going to burst. The silver whistle vibrated so hard it burned his lips. But he didn't stop. Slowly, the violent violet glow faded back to a dull, steady white. The thrumming in the floor settled into a low, rhythmic heartbeat. The hissing steam subsided as the pressure valves finally engaged, diverting the excess heat into the ocean tunnels. The room fell into a sudden, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Mark's ragged breathing. He slumped against the desk, the silver whistle falling from his numb fingers. Vane stayed frozen against the wall for a long minute. Then, he slowly straightened his coat, though he couldn't hide the tremble in his hands. He looked at the core, then at Mark. The arrogant smile was gone, replaced by a look of profound, terrified respect. Harmonics. Vane whispered. He used the frequency of the bay's own echoes to balance the pressure. It's genius. It's impossible. It's not impossible. Mark panted, wiping the sweat and soot from his face. It's Blackwood history. And it's staying here. Mark picked up the silver whistle and the map. He looked at the ladder leading back to his basement. Now, get out, Vane, before I decide to see if the police have a reversionary clause for attempted industrial sabotage and reckless endangerment. Vane didn't argue. He grabbed his briefcase and scrambled up the ladder as if the devil himself were behind him. But as Mark prepared to follow, he noticed something on the desk that hadn't been there before. The heat from the blowout had caused the wood of the desktop to warp, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a single, fresh photograph. It wasn't yellowed or old. It showed a man standing on a pier in a sunny, tropical location. The man was older, his hair white, but his eyes were unmistakable. It was Julian Blackwood, and he was holding a copy of a newspaper from only 1 week ago. The photograph felt like it was burning Mark's hand. He stared at the image of Julian Blackwood, the man he had spent months eulogizing as a tragic victim of a small-town conspiracy. Julian looked healthy, his skin tanned by a sun far warmer than any that ever touched Blackwood Bay. the newspaper in his hand. The Daily Caribbean was dated January 22nd, 2026. "He's alive," Mark whispered into the cooling, silent iron chamber. The realization was a physical blow. The trial, the imprisonment of Thorne and Reed, the justice for a dead man. It had all been based on a ghost story. Julian hadn't died on the rocks, and he hadn't been murdered by the syndicate. He had orchestrated the ultimate exit, leaving behind a trail of clues that would eventually lead a curious stranger like Mark to dismantle his enemies for him. Mark looked back at the hidden compartment. Beside the photo was a small, handwritten note on a simple white card. The ink was fresh. "To Mark. You've done a fine job with the house. The garden looks much better with the hydrangeas. Thank you for handling Thorne. He was always a nuisance. But even I couldn't have predicted he'd be so easily undone by a writer's curiosity. You're wondering why I stayed away. The iron chamber is a gift, but it is also a target. As long as I was alive, the syndicate would never stop hunting me for the access codes. By dying, I gave the secret time to breathe. By finding the override, you've proven you are the right keeper. Enjoy the royalties, Mark. You earned them. But remember, the fog never truly clears. It just waits for the wind to change. J.B." Mark felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger at being used, relief that the man was safe, and a deep, unsettling awe at Julian's brilliance. Julian hadn't just been a victim. He was the ultimate architect. He had recruited Mark from across the country without ever meeting him, simply by leaving a house that was a giant, irresistible puzzle. He heard the sound of Vane's SUV speeding away from the house above. The retrieval specialist was gone, likely to report his failure to his mysterious masters in London. But Mark knew Vane wouldn't be back. After nearly being vaporized by a geothermal blowout, the London firm would realize that the Blackwood legacy was too volatile to handle. Mark climbed the ladder back to his basement, his muscles aching and his head spinning. He emerged into the hidden room and closed the circular hatch. As the magnetic seal engaged, the house felt different. It no longer felt like a grave or a museum. It felt like a workshop. He walked upstairs and stood on the porch, looking out at the bay. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. Elena's truck was coming up the hill. She had likely seen the steam venting from the cliffs and was coming to check on him. How could he tell her? How could he tell the town that their legendary martyr was actually sipping a cold drink on a beach 3,000 miles away? He looked at the photograph one last time. Then he did something he never thought he would do. He walked to the small fireplace in the living room, struck a match, and watched the image of the living Julian Blackwood turn to ash. "The story is better this way," Mark muttered. Some secrets were meant to stay in the fog. He had his book, the town had its justice, and Julian had his peace. Mark was the keeper of the iron chamber now, and as the first stars began to appear over the Atlantic, he realized his real work was only just beginning. The crackle of the fireplace was the only sound in the living room as the last corner of the photograph curled into a black flake. Mark watched the smoke rise, feeling the weight of a secret that was now entirely his own. He heard the heavy crunch of gravel outside and knew it was Elena. He quickly wiped the soot from his hands and met her at the door. Elena looked frantic. Her hair was windswept, and her boots were caked in mud. "Mark." "I saw the steam venting from the cliffside. It looked like the earth itself was boiling. And I saw Vane's car tearing down the hill like the devil was chasing him. What happened down there?" Mark took a steadying breath. He couldn't tell her the truth about Julian. Not yet, and perhaps not ever. It was a burden she didn't need, and it would undo the closure the town had finally found. Vane tried to force the seal, Mark said, leaning against the doorframe. He triggered a pressure spike. It almost brought the house down, but I managed to stabilize it using a manual override Julian's grandfather left behind. Elena stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. She noticed the heat radiating from the floorboards and the faint smell of ozone. He's gone, then. Vane. He won't be back. Mark replied. He realized that the assets here aren't something you can just put in a briefcase. They're tied to the geology of the bay. It's too dangerous for them now. Elena let out a long, shaky sigh of relief. Good. Let the London lawyers choke on their paperwork. But Mark, if that chamber is active, what does it mean for the town? Is it safe? Mark thought of the violet glow and the rhythmic heartbeat of the geothermal core. It's safer now than it has been in 80 years. I've balanced the pressure. But it needs a guardian. Someone to monitor the levels and ensure the vents stay clear. Julian's grandfather built a masterpiece, Elena. It's a source of clean energy that could power this entire coast if we're careful. But it's also a bomb if it's handled with greed. Elena looked at him, her expression softening. And you're going to stay. You're going to be that guardian. Mark looked around his living room. The books, the fireplace, the quiet shadows. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was the anchor. I think the house chose me for a reason. I'm not just writing the story of Blackwood Bay. I'm helping to write its future. That night, after Elena left, Mark returned to the basement. He didn't go down the ladder. He sat at the small wooden table in the hidden room and opened a new notebook. He began to translate the Victorian engineer's runic scales into modern physics. He had the silver whistle, the map, and the knowledge of a living ghost. As he worked, a low, comforting thrum rose through the floor, the heartbeat of the earth, synchronized with the pulse of the iron chamber. The fog began to roll in outside, thick and white. But for the first time, Mark didn't see it as a shroud. It was a shield, protecting the secrets that lay beneath the stone. The weeks following Silas Vane's departure were the quietest Mark had ever known. The town had settled into a comfortable rhythm, fueled by the success of his book and the new tourism it brought to the bay. But Mark remained vigilant. He spent his mornings in the iron chamber, learning the language of the core. He had discovered that the heartbeat of the machine changed depending on the tides and the moon. It was a living, breathing part of the planet. One evening, while monitoring the acoustic sensors, Mark noticed a fluctuation that didn't match the tidal patterns. It was a rhythmic pulse, 3 short bursts, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. Mark whispered, his heart skipping a beat. He checked the sensors. The signal wasn't coming from the geothermal vents or the sea tunnels. It was being transmitted through the quartz sphere itself, using the harmonic resonance he had learned to manipulate with the silver whistle. Someone was trying to communicate through the very fabric of the iron chamber. Mark grabbed the silver whistle and blew a single, long note, AK, the signal for go-ahead in Morse code. He waited, the silence of the chamber pressing against his ears. A moment later, the core hummed in response. The violet light flickered in a complex pattern. He scrambled to his notebook, decoding the light pulses. It wasn't a distress call from a sinking ship. It was a coordinate, a set of numbers pointing to a location far out in the North Atlantic, near a cluster of uninhabited islands known as the Outer Skellings. "Is this you, Julian?" Mark wondered aloud. He knew that the Outer Skellings were notorious for their treacherous reefs and ancient legends of hidden caches. If Julian was sending him a signal, it meant the piece he had found in the Caribbean was either a ruse or had been compromised. Or perhaps, the iron chamber wasn't the only prototype Julian's grandfather had built. Mark went back up to the house and looked at the map of the coast. The Skellings were nearly 50 miles offshore, a dangerous journey for any small vessel, especially with the spring storms beginning to brew. He couldn't go to the police, and he didn't want to involve Elena and risk her life again. This was a Blackwood secret, and he was the keeper. He looked at the small, leather-bound ledger he had found in the desk. In the back, there were mentions of a secondary node at the Skellings, a relay station designed to amplify the perfect beacon signal. If that station was still active, or if someone had found it, the entire geothermal network could be compromised. Mark felt the familiar pull of the mystery. He had promised to be the guardian, and that meant protecting the secret from external threats. He needed a boat, one faster and sturdier than a fishing trawler. He thought of the Silver Tern and Elena's expertise, but he hesitated. He was tired of putting people in danger. Then, he remembered a name Arthur had mentioned once, a man who lived in the marshes and dealt in specialized marine equipment, a man who didn't ask questions if the gold was pure. Mark reached into his pocket and felt the weight of Julian's ring. He had the means. He just needed the courage to step back into the fog. The marshes of Blackwood Bay were a labyrinth of tall saltgrass and shifting mudflats, a place where the ocean and the land fought a never-ending war. Mark drove his old truck as far as the road would allow, then continued on foot through the rising mist. He was looking for a man known only as Cutter, a name whispered in the local pubs as the person you saw when you needed to disappear or go somewhere no sane sailor would venture. He found the dwelling, a cluster of rusted shipping containers and driftwood shacks perched on a pier of barnacle-crusted pilings. The air here smelled of diesel, rotting seaweed, and old secrets. A large, one-eyed dog growled from the shadows as Mark approached the center shack. "I'm looking for Cutter," Mark announced, his voice steady despite the eerie silence of the marsh. A man emerged from behind a stack of weathered lobster pots. He was lean, with skin like tanned leather and hands that looked strong enough to bend rebar. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a piece of the coast itself. He wiped grease from his palms with a rag and eyed Mark's expensive coat. "You're the writer," Cutter said, his voice a low rasp. "The one who poked the nest and sent the mayor to the clink. What's a man of letters doing in the muck?" "I need a boat," Mark said, leaning against a piling. "Something fast, low profile, something that can handle the crosscurrents near the outer skellings." Cutter's eyes narrowed. "The skellings? That's a graveyard for ships and souls alike. There's nothing out there but jagged rock and ghosts. Why would you want to go there?" "I'm looking for a signal," Mark replied, choosing his words carefully. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single gold coin, one he had found in a secondary compartment of the iron chamber. It wasn't standard currency. It bore the Blackwood bird. Cutter caught the coin in the air. He bit the edge, then turned it over in his rough fingers. His expression changed from suspicion to a strange, quiet reverence. "I haven't seen one of these in 20 years. Julian used to pay my father with these when he needed to move supplies to the high point without the harbor master's eyes on him." He led Mark to a hidden cove behind the containers. Floating there, tied to a submerged pier, was a sleek, matte black interceptor. It looked like a ghost ship, stripped of all markings, powered by 3 massive outboard engines. "She's called the Nocturne," Cutter said. "Carbon fiber hull, silent exhaust, and deep V construction. She'll get you to the skellings in under 2 hours, even in a swell. But listen to me, Mark, the skellings aren't just rocks. My father used to say the water out there doesn't boil because of the tide. It boils because of what's underneath." Mark stepped onto the deck, feeling the power of the vessel beneath his feet. "I know what's underneath, Cutter. That's exactly why I have to go." As he prepared the engines, Cutter handed him a heavy waterproof case. "Take this. It's a flare kit and an old-school sextant. Electronics are a lie out there. The magnetism from the reefs will spin your GPS like a top. Trust the stars and your gut." Mark nodded, the engines purring to life with a predatory hum. He steered the Nocturne out through the narrow marsh channel, the fog swallowing the land behind him. He was heading for the outer skellings, into the heart of the signal, to find out if Julian Blackwood was a savior, a ghost, or something much more dangerous. The Nocturne lived up to its name, slicing through the black Atlantic swells like a phantom. As Mark moved further from the mainland, the familiar comfort of the shore disappeared, replaced by a horizon of jagged peaks and churning foam. The magnetism Cutter warned him about was real. The digital compass on the dash flickered and died, leaving the screen a wash of useless static. Mark pulled the brass compass from his pocket. Julian's compass. Its needle didn't spin. It locked onto a heading as if it were tethered to an invisible wire. The outer skellings rose from the mist like the teeth of a drowned giant. They were a cluster of volcanic rocks, slick with black algae and white sea foam. In the center of the largest formation stood a structure that wasn't on any modern map. It was a tower, smaller than the Blackwood lighthouse but constructed from the same dark, salt-resistant stone. It had no light at its top. Instead, it was capped with a massive copper dome that hummed with a low-frequency vibration. Mark eased the throttle, maneuvering the interceptor into a natural harbor formed by a break in the reef. The water here was strangely calm, but it was warm, almost hot to the touch. Steam rose from the surface in thin, ghostly ribbons. This was the secondary node, the high point Cutter had mentioned. He tied the boat to a rusted iron ring and stepped onto the slick rock. The air was thick with the smell of brine and heated minerals. As he approached the tower, he saw a door made of solid bronze, etched with the same harmonic scales he had seen in the iron chamber. He didn't have a key, but he had the silver whistle. He blew a sequence. Low, high, sustained. The bronze door groaned, the sound echoing off the cliff walls, and slowly swung inward. The interior of the tower was bathed in a soft, blue phosphorescence. It wasn't powered by electricity. The walls were lined with tanks of bioluminescent algae, a living lighting system. In the center of the room, a massive copper shaft descended into the floor, pulsing with the same violet light as the core back home. "I knew you'd come, Mark. You have your father's curiosity, even if you don't have his blood." The voice didn't come from a ghost. It came from a man sitting in a high-backed chair near a bank of brass monitors. He looked older than the man in the photograph, his face a map of deep lines and sun-weathered skin. He was holding a small, silver flute. Mark froze, his hand on the whistle. "Julian. Or is this another layer of the fog?" The man stood up slowly. He wasn't the martyr the town spoke of, nor was he the architect Mark had imagined. He was a man who looked exhausted by the weight of his own secrets. "I am Julian Blackwood, and we have very little time. The signal I sent through the core wasn't just for you. It was a tripwire. When you used the whistle to stabilize the blowout, you alerted more than just me. You alerted the Sentinels." "The Sentinels?" Mark asked, his voice echoing in the blue-lit chamber. "You mean the firm from London?" "Silas Vane." "Vane was a pawn," Julian said, walking toward the copper shaft. "He works for men who think in centuries, not fiscal years. They don't want the energy, Mark. They want the frequency. They want a way to silence the Earth's pulse so they can harvest the minerals beneath the tectonic plates without causing the quakes that would destroy their cities. They want to turn the planet into a machine, and the iron chamber is the only thing that can stop them." Suddenly, the tower shook. A massive shockwave rippled through the rock, and the blue algae in the tanks flickered and died. Outside, the Nocturne began to rock violently against the pier. A large, dark shape was emerging from the water, a submarine, modern and lethal, breaking the surface like a leviathan. The submarine was a sleek, windowless monolith of matte black steel, rising from the churning surf of the skellings like a predator from the abyss. It bore no flag, no registration numbers, only a single, stark white insignia on its conning tower, a stylized eye enclosed in a triangle. "The Hollowell Group," Julian whispered, his eyes fixed on the vessel. "They've stopped pretending to be lawyers and surveyors. That is a recovery sub, Mark. It's equipped with high-yield thermal drills. They aren't here to negotiate. They're here to lance the node." Mark watched as a hatch on the deck of the submarine slid open. 6 figures emerged, clad in tactical gear and pressurized diving suits. They didn't carry standard rifles. They carried long, sleek devices that looked like sonic emitters. If they drill into this reef, Julian continued, his voice tight with urgency, they'll break the seal on the geothermal vent. The pressure here is 10 times what it is under your house. It won't just be an explosion, Mark. It will trigger a localized tsunami that will wipe Blackwood Bay off the map. We have to stop them, Mark said, his mind racing. He looked at the copper shaft in the center of the room. Can the override work here? Can we vent the pressure before they reach the core? Julian shook his head. Not from here. This tower is a receiver, a stabilizer. The control hub is back at the house. But there is a way to jam their drills. The Hollowell drills rely on precise acoustic frequencies to shatter the rock. If we can flood the area with a counter-frequency, we can turn their drill bits into useless scrap metal. The silver whistle. Mark realized, holding up the small instrument. Exactly, Julian said. But the whistle alone isn't powerful enough to reach through the water. We need to use the tower's copper dome as an amplifier. I'll need you to climb the exterior ladder to the lightning rod. You have to blow the whistle directly into the induction coil while I pulse the bioluminescent tanks to distract their sensors. Climb the tower. Mark looked out at the lashing rain and the freezing spray. The tower was nearly 60 feet high, and the wind was screaming across the skellings at gale force. It's the only way, Mark. They're already launching their ROV. Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed the whistle, tucked it into his jacket, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical wall, the salt spray stinging his skin. He found the iron rungs set into the dark stone and began to climb. Below him, the black submarine sat like a tombstone in the harbor, and he could see the glowing red lights of the remote-operated vehicle descending into the dark water. His fingers were numb, and the wind threatened to rip him from the stone with every gust. He reached the top, where the massive copper dome sat pulsing with a faint, residual heat. He crawled toward the central coil, a spire of twisted copper that hummed with static electricity. He saw the ROV's lights flash beneath the surface as it positioned itself against the reef. A low, vibrating hum began to rise from the water, the sound of the thermal drill engaging. The rock beneath him began to shudder. Mark raised the whistle to his lips. He didn't blow the high, low, high sequence this time. He remembered the maps in the ion chamber, the chaos frequency. He took a deep breath, braced himself against the copper spire, and blew with every ounce of strength in his lungs. The sound was amplified 1,000 times by the dome. A visible ripple of acoustic energy distorted the air, a shimmering wave that hammered down into the water. Below, the red lights of the ROV flickered and died. A secondary explosion of sparks erupted from the submarine's deck as their sensors overloaded. Mark kept blowing, his vision blurring, the frequency vibrating through his very bones. For a moment, he wasn't just a writer or a guardian. He was the voice of the Earth itself, screaming back at the machines. The chaos frequency didn't just jam the drills. It tore through the air like a physical blow. Mark felt the copper dome beneath him vibrate with such intensity that the rivets groaned. Below, the Hollowell submarine rocked as if hit by a rogue wave. The acoustic feedback from the dome had created a resonant loop, turning the water into a churning cauldron of white noise and spray. Inside the submarine, the delicate sensors shattered. The tactical teams on the deck were thrown backward, their sonic emitters sparking and venting acrid smoke. Their pressurized suits, designed to withstand the crushing depths of the ocean, weren't built to withstand a localized harmonic earthquake. Hold on, Mark. Julian's voice drifted up from the tower's internal vents, distorted and metallic. The induction is peaking. Get clear of the coil. Mark scrambled backward just as a bolt of blue static electricity jumped from the copper spire to the stormy sky. The air smelled of burnt ozone. He slid down the ladder, his boots sparking against the rungs, and tumbled back into the blue-lit safety of the tower. Julian was at the consoles, his hands flying across the brass switches. "You did it. The ROV is a total loss, and their primary drill assembly has fused. They've lost their window of precision." "Are they leaving?" Mark gasped, leaning against the cold stone wall, his lungs still burning from the effort. "No," Julian said, pointing to a small sonar screen that was still functioning. "They are pivoting. The Hollowell group doesn't accept failure. They only escalate. They've realized they can't drill the node, so they're going to try and detonate it. They've switched to a depth charge configuration. They'd destroy everything," Mark said, his voice dropping in horror. "The Skellings, the node, the town. They'd rather burn the world than let someone else hold the match." "Exactly," Julian replied. He turned to a heavy iron chest in the corner of the room. He unlocked it with a key that hung around his neck, not a silver or dark metal key, but one made of clear, synthetic diamond. Inside sat a device that looked like a vintage telegraph, but the wires were made of fiber optics. "We have one card left to play. We need to trigger the subduction seal." "What's that?" "It's a failsafe my grandfather built. It uses the pressure of the core to instantly flood the tectonic vents with a rapidly cooling gel catalyst. It will turn the liquid heat beneath us into solid rock in seconds. It will kill the node. Permanently. The energy will be gone, but the explosion will be neutralized. The Hollowell group will be left with nothing but a pile of cold granite." Mark looked at the copper shaft. The violet light was the heart of Blackwood Bay. It was the legacy he had fought for, the perfect beacon that could have changed the world. To destroy it felt like a betrayal. "Is there no other way?" Mark asked. Julian looked at him, his old eyes full of a weary wisdom. "Power is only a gift if the world is ready to use it for good, Mark. Right now, the world is only ready to fight over it. Sometimes, the greatest act of guardianship is knowing when to close the door." A dull thump echoed through the water. The first depth charge had been launched. The tower groaned, and a crack appeared in one of the bioluminescent tanks, the blue liquid leaking across the floor like neon blood. "Do it," Mark said. Julian nodded. He handed Mark the diamond key. "You're the keeper of the story now, Mark. You should be the one to finish it." Mark took the diamond key. It felt strangely warm, vibrating with a high-frequency hum that seemed to sync with his own heartbeat. The subduction seal wasn't just a mechanical switch. It was the final period at the end of a long, dangerous sentence. He looked at the telegraph-like device, its fiber-optic wires glowing like the nervous system of a digital god. "Insert the key into the central conduit," Julian commanded, his voice steady despite the tower groaning under the impact of a second depth charge. "Once it's seated, you must rotate it exactly 180 degrees clockwise. Not a fraction more, or the catalyst will ignite prematurely." Mark stepped toward the conduit. He could feel the raw power of the geothermal node beneath his feet, a primal heat that wanted to expand, to rise, to destroy. He pushed the diamond key into the slot. It fit with a molecular precision. He gripped the key. Outside, a third explosion rocked the Skellings. A hairline fracture spiderwebbed across the bronze floor. "Now!" Julian shouted. Mark turned the key. The subduction sequence. Phase 1. Injection of the endothermic gel catalyst. Phase 2. Molecular bonding with the magmatic vent. Phase 3. Instantaneous thermal crystallization. The reaction was immediate. Through the transparent floor panels, Mark watched as a thick, milky white substance flooded the copper pipes, rushing downward into the fiery heart of the node. The violet light didn't just fade, it turned a jagged, frozen white. The cooling rate was astronomical. The thrumming that had defined Mark's life for the last hour, the heartbeat of the world, simply stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, a physical weight that made his ears ring. The perfect beacon was gone. The iron chamber back at the house would now be nothing more than a cold, empty vault. On the sonar screen, the Hollowell submarine's movements became erratic. They had fired their charges, but instead of a catastrophic geothermal blowout that would have cracked the tectonic plate, they hit a wall of reinforced, crystalline granite. The seismic signatures they were tracking vanished into a flat line. Their prize had turned to stone. "They're retreating," Julian whispered, staring at the screen. "They know the node is dead. There's nothing left here for them to harvest." The black submarine began to submerge, its task a total failure. The Hollowell group would likely vanish back into the shadows of international law, their silent partner contracts now worthless. Mark slumped against the console, the diamond key still in his hand. He looked at Julian. The old man looked 10 years older, the light of his life's work extinguished by his own hand. "Is it over?" Mark asked. "The threat is over," Julian replied, placing a hand on Mark's shoulder. "But the fog is still there, Mark. We have to move quickly. The Nocturne is our only way back before the Coast Guard arrives to investigate the seismic anomalies. We can't be here when they do." Mark stood up, pocketing the diamond key. He looked one last time at the blue-lit chamber, now dimming as the bioluminescent tanks ran out of energy. They had saved the town, but they had sacrificed a miracle to do it. The Nocturne roared to life, its triple engines spitting blue flames into the churning spray of the harbor. Behind them, the Skellings were already fading into the gloom, the dark stone tower standing like a silent headstone for the technology buried beneath it. Mark held the wheel, his knuckles white, while Julian sat in the navigator's seat, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the first hints of a cold, grey dawn were beginning to bleed through the clouds. The ride back was brutal. Without the stabilization of the node's harmonic field, the crosscurrents around the reefs had become unpredictable. The boat jumped from the crest of one wave to the next, the carbon fiber hull groaning under the impact. "You're doing well, Mark," Julian said, his voice barely audible over the screaming wind. Most men would have turned back at the first sight of that sub. "I didn't have much of a choice," Mark shouted back, his eyes squinting against the salt. "You made sure of that when you left a trail of breadcrumbs across half the Atlantic." Julian gave a dry, short laugh. "I didn't leave breadcrumbs. I left a map. You were the only one with the imagination to read it. Thorne and Reed. They saw the world in terms of power and property. You saw it in terms of narrative. That's why you're still standing." As they cleared the outer reefs, the sea began to settle. Mark engaged the silent exhaust, and the Nocturne leveled out, gliding toward the mainland. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the diamond key. It was cold now, its internal vibration stilled. "What happens to this?" Mark asked. "And the iron chamber? If the node is dead, is there anything left to guard? The energy is gone, but the knowledge remains." Julian replied. He took the key from Mark, looking at it with a mixture of regret and relief. The Hollowell group will eventually realize that the catalyst is permanent. But there are other nodes, Mark. Not in Blackwood Bay, but elsewhere. My grandfather wasn't the only one who dreamed of the perfect beacon. He was just the only one who succeeded. Mark looked at the man beside him. "You're going to disappear again, aren't you?" Julian didn't answer immediately. He watched the coastline of Blackwood Bay emerge from the fog, a jagged line of cliffs and the distant, dark silhouette of the lighthouse. "The world thinks I'm dead. In many ways, I am. I'm a man from a century that no longer exists, holding secrets that the current one isn't ready for. If I stay, I'm a target. If I leave, I'm a ghost. And ghosts are much harder to kill. The math of their escape was simple but narrow. They had roughly 40 minutes before the Coast Guard's acoustic buoys flagged the Nocturne's signature. Mark calculated the intercept course, plotting a line that would lead them back into the saltgrass marshes of the northern bay. "We're cutting it close," Mark muttered. "We've been cutting it close for 20 years, Mark," Julian said softly. "A few more minutes won't hurt." As the marshes swallowed them, the engine's hum faded into the rustle of the reeds. The shadow in the fog was finally coming home, but the man who cast it was already preparing to fade away once more. The Nocturne glided into the shallow, brackish waters of the marsh, its hull whispering against the tall salt grass. The morning sun was finally beginning to burn through the thickest of the fog, turning the world into a hazy, golden dreamscape. Mark steered the boat toward Cutter's hidden cove, the engine now little more than a low-frequency purr. Cutter was waiting on the rusted pier, a cigarette dangling from his lip. He didn't look surprised to see Julian. He simply nodded, as if 20 years were merely 20 minutes. "You brought him back," Cutter said, reaching out to catch the Nocturne's line. "Just long enough to say goodbye," Julian replied, stepping onto the rickety wooden slats. He looked back at Mark, who was still standing on the deck of the matte black interceptor. "You have the diamond key, Mark? I thought you took it back on the boat," Mark said, checking his pockets. He felt the cold, hard edges of the synthetic diamond. "I still have it." "Keep it," Julian said. "It's no longer a key to a machine, but a key to a choice. If you ever find another node, and you might, if you keep looking, you'll know what to do. The story doesn't end just because the lights go out." Mark stepped off the boat. The transition from the high-speed chaos of the Atlantic to the stillness of the marsh felt jarring. "What about you, Julian? Where does a ghost go when his haunt is gone?" Julian looked toward a small, nondescript fishing skiff tied at the far end of the pier. It was loaded with supplies, a simple top covering what looked like navigating equipment. There are islands in the south where the fog never reaches, and the people don't ask for your name, only your help with the nets. "I've spent my life guarding a power I couldn't use. I think I'd like to spend the rest of it just being a man." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, leather-bound volume. It was identical to the diary Mark had found behind the fridge, but this one was blank. He handed it to Mark. "Write the rest, Mark. Not just the trial or the blowout. Write about what happens when a town stops living in the shadow of its past. Write about the light that stays after the beacon is dark." Mark took the book. He felt the weight of it, the potential of all those empty pages. "And the house. The iron chamber. The house is yours," Julian said, stepping into the skiff. "The chamber is now just a basement. A very expensive, very sturdy basement. Fill it with something better than secrets. Maybe a wine cellar, or a library. I always thought it would make a good library." Cutter tossed the line to Julian. The skiff's small outboard motor coughed to life. As the boat began to drift away into the mist, Julian raised a hand in a final, silent salute. "Wait," Mark called out. "What about the second key? The one from the history book? Was that for the safe or the tower?" Julian's voice drifted back over the water, thin but clear. "The second key was a test, Mark. It opened nothing but your mind. You found the truth without it." And then, he was gone. The fog swallowed the small boat, leaving only the ripple of the wake against the reeds. Mark stood on the pier, the blank book in one hand and the diamond key in the other. He looked at Cutter, who was already turning back toward his shipping containers. "He's a hard man to keep," Cutter muttered. "He's not a man you keep." Mark replied. "He's a legend you survive." A year had passed since the night at the Outer Skellings. Blackwood Bay was no longer the town of whispers and blue shadows Mark had first encountered. The Hollowell Group had vanished into a series of bankruptcy filings and international lawsuits, their interest in the coast as cold as the granite node beneath the sea. Mark sat in his office, the room that was once Julian's secret chamber. It had been transformed. The copper pipes and brass gauges remained, polished to a dull shine, but the walls were now lined with thousands of books. In the center, where the quartz sphere had once pulsed with violet light, stood a large, circular desk. His second book, The Diamond Failsafe, was sitting on the corner of the desk, its cover featuring a stylized image of a lighthouse piercing a thick mist. It had surpassed the first in sales, but to Mark, it was more than a bestseller. It was a closing statement. Elena walked into the room, carrying 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She looked at the desk, then at the small diamond key that Mark now used as a paperweight. "Still thinking about him?" she asked, setting the coffee down. "Every time the fog rolls in." Mark admitted, looking up. "I wonder if he's actually fishing in the Caribbean, or if he found another breadcrumb in some other forgotten corner of the world." "The town is different now, Mark," Elena said, leaning against the doorway. "People don't look at the cliffs with fear anymore. They look at the marine sanctuary. They look at the new library you funded. You didn't just save the history. You gave us a future that doesn't rely on old ghosts." Mark smiled. He looked at the leather-bound book Julian had given him on the pier. It was no longer blank. It was filled with sketches of the iron chamber, notes on the harmonic frequencies of the bay, and the true story of the night the earth stood still. It was a manual for the next guardian, should one ever be needed. Final observations of the Blackwood estate. Status: stable. Secondary node: dormant. The resident: integrated. The legacy: preserved. As the sun began to set, the old lighthouse on the cliff flickered to life. It wasn't powered by a geothermal core anymore. It ran on modern solar rays and standard electricity. But to the sailors in the bay, it looked exactly the same. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse in the dark, a promise that the shore was near and the path was safe. Mark walked up to the living room and looked out the window. The garden was thriving, the hydrangeas a sea of vibrant blue. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known back in the city. He had come here to write a story about a disappearance, but he had ended up finding himself. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was an email from an encrypted address he didn't recognize. There was no text, only an attached photo. He opened it. It was a shot of a small, bronze plaque set into a stone wall in a city that looked like Prague. On the plaque was the image of a bird and a single date, 1889. Beneath it, in the corner of the frame, was the edge of a silver flute. Mark let out a long breath and a small, knowing laugh. He looked at the diamond key on his desk, then back at the phone. The fog never truly clears. He whispered to the empty room. It just waits for the wind to change. He sat down at his desk, opened his notebook to a fresh page, and began to write. He didn't know where the next journey would take him, but he knew one thing for certain. As long as there were secrets hidden in the mist, there would always be a need for a keeper.